Committee will come to order. Committee meets today to consider potential implications of the Iranian nuclear agreement for the Middle East and for the world. Last week, most of us attended a classified session where the administration negotiators explained and argued for approval of the agreement. They have also been testifying in front of other committees in the Congress in open session. Today, we have the opportunity to hear perspectives from a distinguished panel of experts. One point on which the supporters and opponents of the agreement concur is that this agreement will have wide-ranging, far-reaching consequences. Of course, they differ on whether those consequences will be positive or negative. It seems to me the issues of concern can be broken down into three areas. One are the variety of issues about verification and enforcement. And I would point members to an in-depth report by the Wall Street Journal last week that details how Syria has successfully thwarted and defied inspectors who have now concluded that Assad did not give up all his chemical weapons as he promised. How will Iran be different? A second basket of issues is whether even if the inspections go perfectly and Iran stays in full compliance with the letter and spirit of the agreement, whether it is a good deal or not. As Secretary Shultz and Kissinger wrote back in April, negotiations that began as an effort to prevent Iran from developing a nuclear arsenal are ending with an agreement that concedes that very capability, although several years down the road. The administration argues, of course, that a better agreement was not possible. The third basket are Iran's other activities beyond its nuclear program, to include long-range missile development, support for terrorism, and instigating regional stability. Put it all together, we have huge stakes, long-lasting consequences, and a vote that this Congress must take shortly when we return in September. All of that combines to make it a weighty issue for us all. I yield to the ranking member for any comments he'd like to make.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank you for having this very important hearing. This is an issue that Congress will have to vote on, one we cannot avoid. Although Lord knows we've avoided a whole lot of others, this one is coming at us. And I think that's a very good thing. It gives us a chance to be deliberative, to listen to experts like the ones we have before us today, and to have a really robust debate about what exactly the agreement does. And right off the bat, just to disagree a little bit with a couple of things that the chairman said, explicitly in the agreement is Iran agreeing to never build a nuclear weapon. They had to agree to that. Now, they can obviously lie, cheat, and steal, but it's wrong to say that the agreement says, you know, you after 15 years have permission to do whatever you want. I think that's one of the perceptions that is out there, that they don't. Second of all, there has been some comments about how, you know, after 15 years, we legitimize the Iranian nuclear program. There's one thing that has never really been clear in the UN protocols on nuclear programs. It has been clear that you don't have a right to build a nuclear weapon. What hasn't been clear is the right to enrich. That lack of clarity really doesn't change. Now, yes, the agreement does allow Iran to then go back to the number of centrifuges or more than they have right now, but it doesn't have this big, huge open door post 15 years that a lot of people have been talking about. At the 15-year point, we'll have a challenge, no question, but look at the challenge that we have right now. Iran has 19,000 centrifuges. Prior to the short-term agreement, they had a large amount of uranium enriched at 20%. What this agreement does clearly do for at least the next 15 years is significantly degrades Iran's ability to enrich uranium. It takes them down to about 5,000 centrifuges, 5,000 and some odd. They face regular inspections, and I will point out that one difference between Iran and Syria is Iran is not a war zone. It is a little bit of a clearer picture for the IAEA to go in and do the inspections. It forces Iran to get rid of almost all of its enriched uranium, down to, I believe, and I'm going to get my 300 300 something, I forget the amount, vastly less than what they have right now. It takes them back much further from where they are right now. And that more or less lasts for 15 years. I think the other thing to consider, in comments that I'd be interested in, if we reject this, there's a couple of issues. One, a number of people have suggested that we can go back and get a better deal. I don't think that's even really plausible when you look at Russia, China, the EU, the fact that the UN has already approved the deal, that all those players would come back to the table, let alone Iran, I think is a bit of an assumption. But the other question is, so we don't come back to the table, we reject the deal. What happens then? Well, we know that Iran is able to keep everything they've got. They're able to, basically at that point, there is no restrictions on them whatsoever. So what happens if we reject the deal? One of the things I'm interested in hearing, and I, relatively new to this issue, there may be, we're all relatively new to this issue since the agreement was just passed a few weeks ago. What are the plausible scenarios? What are the good scenarios if we reject this agreement that put us in a better place in terms of controlling Iran and controlling Iran's nuclear program? And I freely admit that Iran is a horrific actor in the Middle East and not to be trusted. But the stated goal of these negotiations was to try to halt their nuclear program, to try to make sure that Iran did not have a nuclear weapon. And judged on that, as I've mentioned, I think some progress was made. Now, I still have concerns about what happens after 15 years, and I still want to hear some experts play out, okay, here's what happens if we do the agreement, here's what happens if we don't, because as I said, we're all relatively new to this. There are scenarios we may not have thought of, but I do think that there have been some erroneous comments out there about what this agreement does and doesn't do, and I hope we can clear that up as well. With that, I yield back and look forward to the testimony.
Thank you. I hope our witnesses can clear up a variety of issues for us today. We're pleased to have Mr. Michael Singh with the Washington Institute, Mr. Michael Einstadt also with the Washington Institute, and Dr. John Alderman with the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS. Without objection, your full written statements will be made part of the record, and so each of you will now be recognized to summarize your comments as you'd like. Mr. Singh, we'll start with you. Thanks again for being here.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Smith, members of the committee. The nuclear agreement with Iran has both strong and weak points, and it's worthy of careful consideration. However, my judgment is that the deal not only leaves Iran with a significant nuclear weapons capability, but arguably allows it to improve that capability over the life of the deal while providing Iran with broad sanctions relief, which I believe has been Iran's twofold objective throughout the talks. Making a nuclear weapon requires three things: weapons-grade fuel, weaponization, and a delivery vehicle. It would also presumably require secrecy because U.S. officials believe it's not in declared facilities, but in covert facilities that Iran would make a nuclear weapon. So what does the agreement do on these three key fronts? On fuel fabrication, the agreement permits Iran to continue R&D on advanced centrifuges and begin deploying them in 8.5 years. As these are far more efficient than Iran's existing centrifuges, they're well suited for a clandestine nuclear program. What's more, the deal's restrictions will phase out after 10 to 15 years, which you mentioned, Ranking Member Smith, which means that after that time, Iran's breakout time that we've talked about quite a bit will go down to about zero, frankly, if Iran chooses to make it that at its declared facilities. On weaponization, the second plank here, the agreement doesn't appear to require Iran to disclose the full extent of its past weaponization work or provide the IAEA with access to the facilities, personnel, and documents involved in that weaponization work, which would be vital to ensuring that the work isn't resumed in the future. And indeed, I would say it's simply not clear from the text of the agreement what is required from Iran when it comes to what we call PMD, possible military dimensions of its nuclear program. On delivery vehicles, the third prong of the nuclear weapons program, the agreement not only does not restrict Iran's ballistic missile activities, but it appears to remove previous bans on such activity. So ballistic missile launches, which were banned previously, prior to this agreement, will now appear to be permitted under this agreement as of implementation day. And it also permits, after no more than 8 years, critical foreign assistance to Iran's medium-range and long-range ballistic missile programs. So having left Iran with this nuclear weapons capability, the agreement's success will depend on detecting and responding to cheating. But the deal does not allow, as far as I can tell, for timely access to suspect sites. If inspectors suspect diversion from the declared facilities, their tools for following up on it are limited and weak. If Iran continues to refuse access under this accord or otherwise violates the deal, the only remedy prescribed in the deal is the accord's termination. Concern over such an outcome likely means that our allies will hesitate to punish small violations, and IAEA inspectors may hesitate even to demand access in the first place for fear of causing the accord's collapse. We've witnessed this dynamic in situations which the members here are well aware of, the Russian violations of the INF Treaty, as you mentioned, Mr. Chairman, Syrian violations of its chemical weapons pledges. Not only have these violations, these reported violations, gone unpunished, from my perspective, U.S. officials have been loath even to acknowledge the violations. The leverage in these situations tends to be with the less risk-averse party. In terms of the broader implications of the deal, the agreement seems likely to lead to further instability in the Middle East. I believe Iranian behavior is likely to worsen, not improve, in the deal's wake for reasons I outlined in my written statement. And the deal seems likely to facilitate that increase in regional troublemaking by Iran. Iran's going to gain a financial windfall from this agreement, which it can use to help some financially squeezed proxies like Hezbollah or Palestinian Islamic Jihad and expand its influence in other places like Iraq. It will face fewer impediments on arming those proxies because the agreement removes the ban on Iran's export of arms. And it will also face fewer impediments to building up its own atrophied military capabilities because in 5 years the ban on the import of arms into Iran is lifted and frankly, for practical purposes, may go away before that. This is likely going to spur a counter-reaction by our allies in the region who perceive Iran as their chief threat. And I'd say we're already seeing this dynamic play out in places like Yemen and Syria and elsewhere. And it could even in the future take the form of our allies seeking nuclear weapons capabilities of their own to match and guard against a potential nuclear breakout in Iran. In addition, I'd say the deal could also lead to a significant strengthening of ties between Iran and Russia, and especially between Iran and China, which have been expanding their military ties in recent years, and have both expressed a desire to expand them even further. Now, some of these regional implications, I'd say would be the inevitable consequence of any nuclear agreement, which isn't preceded by an Iranian strategic shift, which is why it's important to get a strong deal whose benefit outweighs these costs, and to more robustly counter Iranian regional behavior, which frankly is something we should have been doing long before this, not waiting for this deal to do that. But having failed to do either of these things, it's not surprising that our allies suspect that we're engaged either in a strategic reversal or a realignment of some kind in the region. And our reassurances to them are not likely to be compelling, in part because they conflict with our actions and our policies in the region, and in part because they see sort of the fate of previous reassurances, I'd say, to Ukraine, for example, in 1994, which we gave in the pursuit of a different arms control treaty at that time. Folks advocating the deal quite appropriately ask what the alternative is, as you mentioned, Ranking Member Smith. I have little doubt that a stronger agreement could have been negotiated. Ironically, it is our downplaying of the alternatives which I think most contributed to the weakness of our negotiating position and to this deal. Continuing to play down the alternatives, I fear, will only weaken the deal's enforcement mechanisms even further. If this deal doesn't move forward, the other parties will either have to implement the deal without us or walk away from it. If they walk away from it, I think we and our allies will essentially be back to the drawing board. That's my assessment. Even if the deal moves forward, because its restrictions expire over 5 to 15 years, the next president will have to devise a new approach to prevent an Iranian nuclear breakout. He or she will be doing so without the benefit of the strong sanctions and international unanimity which we've enjoyed in the past several years. So I'd argue that the question is not whether we need an alternative policy, but when we will need an alternative policy, and whether it's better to strengthen the constraints on Iran now or to try to do so later. The agreement is going to buy time for us, but it also buys time for Iran, which Iran will use to advantage. So I see this ultimately as a deferral, not a resolution of the nuclear crisis, and a costly one. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Eisenstadt?
Chairman Thornberry, Ranking Member Smith, distinguished committee members, thank you for inviting me to testify on the potential regional implications of the nuclear deal with Iran. It is an honor for me to be here to testify regarding this fateful historic agreement. The nuclear deal between Iran and the P5+1 will have a major impact on Iran's role in the Middle East, America's role in the world, and the nuclear nonproliferation regime. The agreement has major shortcomings and absent steps to mitigate these, and I'm not sure it will be possible to do so. The deal will be a game changer that enables Iran to meet its growing regional military commitments, bolster its regional alliance system, and eventually become a nuclear weapon state. Today, I would like to provide an initial assessment of the impact of the deal with Iran on the latter's ability to project influence in the Middle East by looking at what the agreement says about conventional arms transfers, ballistic missiles, and its nuclear program. Regarding conventional arms transfers, remarkably, the agreement is not clear whether it actually bans Iranian arms transfers. At any rate, Iran has been transferring weapons to its regional allies for years in violations of previous UN resolutions and has vowed to continue to do so. The U.S. says it will interdict future transfers, but this seems unlikely because doing so could cause Iran to blow up the deal. The deal does ban the transfer of major weapon systems to Iran for 5 years, though Iran claims that this prohibition lacks a legal basis and it will fight it. At any rate, the ban does not apply to ammunition, small arms and light weapons, and light tactical vehicles, the kinds of arms that Iran and its regional allies need most at this time. In terms of ballistic missiles, the deal calls upon Iran to avoid testing and developing ballistic missiles designed to deliver nuclear weapons for 8 years. Iran claims that none of its missiles are designed for this purpose, so this article is null and void. The deal is silent about cruise missiles, a major omission. Because the deal does not require the monitoring of labs and personnel involved in alleged past efforts to modify missile warheads to accommodate nuclear payloads, Iran will presumably be able to continue such work. Nuclear weapons. The agreement imposes important constraints on Iran's declared nuclear program and its known facilities. For this reason, should Iran decide to acquire nuclear weapons, it would likely attempt to break out using clandestine facilities. This may not be possible now, but Iran might be able to create such an option in the course of the coming decade. At any rate, the monitoring system created by the deal cannot prevent low-signature activities associated with nuclear weapons research, such as computer simulations and the manufacture of non-nuclear weapons components. That is the baseline situation today. Future developments, however, may negatively impact our ability to detect and respond to a clandestine program in Iran. For instance, intelligence. While Iran is a prime target of U.S. intelligence today, future crises in the Ukraine, East Asia, or elsewhere could force U.S. to divert intelligence assets, degrading its ability to follow developments in Iran. P5+1 unity. The success of IAEA monitoring will depend on the unity of the P5+1. Political differences among them could undermine inspections, as occurred in Iraq in the late 1990s. Snapback. There's been much talk about sanctioned snapback, but it's still not clear exactly how this would work in practice. At any rate, snapback could provide Iran with a pretext to blow up the entire agreement, and for that reason, the U.S. is unlikely to resort to sanctioned snapback, except in extremis. Centrifuges. The deal allows Iran to research and build more advanced, efficient centrifuges, which could someday enable Iran to build a small clandestine enrichment plant that would be hard to detect. Hardening and protection. The deal will allow Iran to eventually acquire advanced air defenses, raising the costs of potential preventive action down the road. And 10 to 15 years hence, the U.S. military may no longer have the ability to destroy Iran's hardened, buried facilities by conventional means. And the agreement commits the parties to help Iran counter-sabotage, possibly limiting our non-kinetic options in Iran in the future. And then finally, past weapons work, or PMD. If Iran proves able to get sanctions lifted without answering the IAEA's questions about PMD, it may opt to cheat again in the belief that if caught, it can once again negotiate its way out of the crisis. So the deal may set a bad precedent for the future and encourage future cheating. So for the deal to succeed, the U.S. needs an implementation strategy that mitigates the agreement's flaws. And in my paper that I submitted, I outlined the major elements of such a strategy, including working with our allies to eliminate ambiguities in the deal, to push back against Iranian influence in order to deter cheating in the framework of the nuclear agreement, taking steps to strengthen our ability to deter a breakout by military means, strengthening the credibility of our military threats against Iran, and then also realizing that since our military capabilities are a wasting asset against this program, working on non-military means of deterrence in the future. So I will conclude by saying that Congress should ask the administration to explain how it plans to deal with the shortcomings of the nuclear deal with Iran and the challenges it is likely to give rise to. The President's willingness to commit to the kind of mitigating measures and implementing strategy that I outlined in my submitted remarks will be an indicator of whether the deal will stand a chance of achieving its intended goal, or will further destabilize the Middle East, further undermine America's standing in the region, and eventually pave the way for an Iranian bomb. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Alderman.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Ranking Members, distinguished members of the committee, thank you very much for having me today. I'm honored to be with you. My testimony that I submitted explores the current regional reaction to the agreement, likely scenarios if the agreement is implemented, and likely scenarios if Congress blocks its implementation. If implemented, I don't think this agreement is going to end tensions between the U.S. and Iran or end Iranian misbehavior in the Middle East. Iran will remain a focus of U.S. foreign policy, and the United States will remain a focus of Iranian foreign policy. But fixing all of the problems of Iranian behavior is not a prerequisite to supporting this agreement. This agreement is important as much because it is among the P5+1 as that it is with Iran. The prospect of Iranian misbehavior means that it is important that the world stands with the United States to confront what I think is likely to be Iranian misbehavior. And my fear is that blocking this agreement will not leave things as they are, but make things much, much worse. If blocked, I foresee worse Iranian behavior on both the nuclear front and the asymmetrical warfare front. I see far weakened U.S. tools to deal with it, partly because countries will be less willing to work with the United States, and partly because some of these extraordinary international financial tools developed in the Bush administration to reach out and disrupt terrorist financing and deny their ability to access banking and all those kinds of tools, the kinds of tools that allowed us to reach out and arrest FIFA for corruption, are going to wither because there will be an entire global financial system which will be insulated from the U.S. financial system. And I don't think that's good for U.S. national security. The question before you isn't if this is the best deal. It's not even, is this a good deal? The question before you, I think, is whether it's an adequate deal to hold Iran to account. And my judgment is that it is adequate, partly because it has clearly spelled out enforcement mechanisms judged by a panel that tilts toward the United States. The panel is stacked in favor of us and our allies, and partly because this agreement does absolutely nothing to prevent the U.S. and its allies from punishing Iran for all of the malfeasance that they have been carrying out in the Middle East for the last several years. It seems to me that the proper focus of congressional attention is not perfecting the deal, but instead making clear to the world that Congress will insist on strict implementation and act against those who deviate from this agreement. Congress can also do a great deal to reassure American allies and to secure American allies in the wake of this agreement. There's a tendency in this debate that we're having in this country to build up Iran to something it's not. Iran is not a near peer of the United States. It's not a global hegemon. This is a country whose economy has shrunk for each of the last 5 years. The GDP of Iran is somewhere between my home state of Maryland and the home state of the ranking member of Washington. This is not a huge country. It's not a huge power. The inflation's almost at 20%, high unemployment. This is a country that is writhing in pain. And that gives us all sorts of ways to shape the economic drivers that guide the Iranian government's decision-making. We should seize the opportunity now to capitalize on these drivers, maintaining close ties with the world's leading powers to hold Iran to account. Even if we can't solve all the problems with Iran, this agreement gives us powerful tools to manage those problems from a position of strength that arises not only from the strength of our economy and our military, but also from the strength that arises from our leadership in the world. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. I want to follow up on strict implementation for just a second. Earlier this year, a group of us were in Ukraine where we talked with some of the folks who are charged with conducting inspections in the eastern part of that country with the Minsk Agreement. And one of the things we heard was that sometimes the inspectors just get turned around. You know, they say, you can't go here, it's too dangerous today. But they don't want to pitch too big of a fit because they don't want to lose the access they have. And so I was struck in the reporting that the Wall Street Journal did about Syria that the inspectors didn't want to rock the boat too much even when they were turned away because they would lose the good part that they did. And it just makes me wonder whether inspectors, given what they are asked to do and given the mentality of those they are asked to inspect, whether you can ever really get the verification that an agreement like this would demand. We hear lots about the agreement says you can do this, you can't do that, but if it's not enforced, if it's not implemented that way, then there's not much to the agreement. And again, using the Syria example, I agree with Mr. Smith, it's a war zone. On the other hand, Syria is not as sophisticated as Iran in hiding things. They have very close relations, obviously. But it was a great triumph of the Obama administration that they removed all the chemical weapons from Syria. It turns out scientists were continuing to work on new weapons. It turns out they had these mobile labs disguised as trucks with billboards along the side. It turns out that they continue to use chemical weapons to kill people. And the bottom line was the inspectors were just not able to do the job that was asked of them. And so even the administration admits now that all the weapons were not removed. Now their argument also, by the way, is we got a lot of it out, and so it's better than it was, which may be true. On the other hand, if what you don't see is all the activity of a nuclear program, then obviously it has huge implications for this deal. Mr. Singh, you mentioned it. Am I barking up the wrong tree here? Are there lessons to be learned from Ukraine, INF, and Syria inspections which have not worked as well as we hoped?
Well, Mr. Chairman, I think you do raise a valid point. You know, when you look at arms control treaties during the Cold War, when you look at Libya's disarmament in the 2000s, they were based on a sort of mutual interest in seeing the accords work. The U.S. and USSR obviously there was some reciprocity built into those agreements. Libya and some other countries that disarmed of their nuclear programs in the past had made a sort of strategic shift in advance of the agreement, of the sort that we haven't seen from Iran. And so there was a mutual interest in seeing them work. It wasn't that you had one party that, you know, like in this case, refuses to admit that it even ever had a nuclear weapons program. Also, I would say that we can overestimate what we already know about these programs. One thing, Mr. Chairman, which you didn't mention about the Syria case that is mentioned in the Wall Street Journal article you referenced, is that the intelligence community felt they had a full picture of Syria's chemical weapons program, which turns out not to have been the case. And according to this report, they've now reassessed that picture, and unfortunately it shows that Syria still possesses significant chemical weapons capabilities. So I do think that we tend to put too much weight on the inspectors' shoulders. You know, the inspectors in this agreement that's been reached with Iran will have to go through a lengthy back and forth if they suspect that there might be some undeclared activity to try to clarify that with Iran. And then I do think there's a possibility that they'll hesitate to make a formal request for access because they know that that starts that 24-day clock ticking, which could lead to the unraveling of the entire agreement. And so there will be that sort of psychological barrier of how sure are you really, is it worth risking the entire agreement for this request for access? And again, if they don't have U.S. intelligence, if they don't have the sort of weight of the international community behind them, backing them up, I do question whether they'll be willing to go forward with that.
If I could just build on Mike's comment. I mentioned in my presentation the whole issue of P5+1 unity, because in the mechanism for dealing with situations where there's a suspect site and they can't get resolution with Iran for access, there's a procedure whereby you have 5 of the 8 members of the Joint Commission agree. They have to agree on a way forward and recommendations. And that's based on the assumption that the Russians and the Chinese and the Iranians might not agree, but the rest of the other 5 will maintain unity on this. But we saw in the course of our inspections in Iraq in the 90s is that in the course of the decade, the French and the Russians eventually fell off, and the P5 were no longer united, and this hindered the inspections towards the latter years. Although, of course, by then, Iraq had more or less been functionally disarmed, but it did, in terms of tying up loose ends, it really hindered their efforts. So this will be an intensely political process, and we can't assume that the unity that exists today might not shatter in coming years and hinder our ability to, deal with this problem down the road.
Okay. Dr. Alderman, do you have a comment on this?
Just briefly, sir, when I worked in the Senate 25 years ago for Senator Moynihan, we had a law professor in the office, and we were going through the SALT II negotiations. I asked them a very similar question about, well, how do you make sure that people are actually following international law? And he said it's like speed limits. The goal is not always 100% compliance of 100% of the people 100% of the time, but you certainly shape what people are able to do. Mike mentioned Iraq. The fact is, we had inspectors. Saddam Hussein played all sorts of stupid games, but he didn't have a nuclear program. We thought he had a nuclear program, but in fact, he wasn't able to sustain a nuclear program in part because he never knew what the inspectors did. He never knew where the inspectors would go. We combined the inspections with all sorts of intelligence from all over the world. And it seems to me that while Iraq was frustrating in any number of ways, the arms control community, of which I'm not a member, but the arms control community feels Iraq was generally successful because the goal was to keep Saddam Hussein from getting a nuclear bomb, and he was really far away, really far away.
Interesting question, why that he made that decision, but I'll yield to Mr. Smith.
Yeah, just a couple quick points. First of all, on the arms transfer issue from Iran, there is a separate UN law against that. So blaming this agreement for not stopping Iran from being able to transfer arms outside is completely beside the point. It is illegal now under international law for Iran to transfer those arms. That's why we occasionally in Israel and other places, are able to seize ships that are doing that. So this agreement doesn't affect that. Now, certainly Iran has found ways around that international agreement. Won't disagree with that in the least bit, but to blame this agreement for not stopping those arms shipments completely misses the point that there is a separate international law that is trying to do that, however difficult that may be. The other point is to emphasize what Dr. Alterman said about how inspections can clearly work, and Iraq is the best example. They can work even where the country in question does not wish to cooperate. And I can't say it any better than Dr. Alterman did. In that instance, it clearly did prove effective. The other big question is, if in fact the P5+1 is going to unravel over the course of this deal, one of my big concerns going into this is if the status quo could be held, if the P5+1 was going to hold those sanctions and continue to punish Iran in that way, and we knew that was going to happen, that would be one thing. But if you're saying that this is going to unravel even with the agreement, the concern that a lot of people had is that China and Russia in particular, but even Europe, I mean, keep in mind, Europe was doing business with Iran early on, that if we simply say, look, we're just going to keep sanctioning them forever, and use that as our approach, the concern was that Russia and China in particular, that would unravel. And eventually you would have fewer and fewer restrictions on transfers of money to Iran as the rest of the world moved away from us. And as Dr. Altman pointed out, the United States likes to think that we're the only ones that can have a banking community, but the world is changing. And if we tell the rest of the world, look, you can't do business with us if you do business with Iran, a good chunk of the rest of the world is going to set up a separate system, as China, by the way, was already doing a couple years ago before they stopped and entered into these negotiations. So the concern is if we keep things where they're at, that too will unravel, particularly if we reject an agreement that the whole rest of the world has agreed to. And that unraveling will leave Iran, not 10 years from now or 15 years from now, but now with 19,000 centrifuges, with a great deal more uranium, with a great deal more enrichment capability. So I still haven't really heard the alternative approach. And the one question I do have is, I believe, Mr. Singh, you said we need to do, quote, more, end quote, to check Iran's aggression in the region. What would that be exactly?
Thank you, Ranking Member Smith. Some of the points you raised, let me just give you my clarifications. The arms export ban on Iran, the ban which prohibits Iran from exporting any arms whatsoever, was part of Resolution 1747. That's been lifted now. I think what you're referring to are bans on the receipt on any country shipping arms to certain groups, which are terrorist groups and so forth. Those are separate authorities, and so the arms ban which was in place on Iran is lifted, as far as I can tell, under this agreement. They still couldn't ship arms to these prescribed groups that nobody can ship arms to under, say, Resolution 1701, which addresses Hezbollah. I would say that from my perspective, having worked very closely on these issues, it's a lot easier if we can stop the arms from getting to Iran in the first place, because interdictions are hard. You need to have intelligence, you need to have the will and capability of the local partners and so forth, and those things often are where we fall down. The Iraq inspections, the main point about the Iraq inspections, I would say here, is that these are not Iraq-style inspections. And so whatever point you may make about how it worked in the 1990s, these won't be the same. And so it's not an apt analogy from my point of view. The P5+1, I don't think
Sorry, they won't be the same how exactly?
These are not Iraq-style inspections. These are not the sort of anytime, anywhere inspections. These are inspections where you have continuous monitoring at a list of declared sites. If you have suspect activity elsewhere, the IEA has to make a request to the Iranians, which starts that clock. So you have a separate, quite a different inspection regime under this agreement than I think Dr. Alterman was referring to, although he can clarify that if he chooses. Was the P5+1 in danger of unraveling prior to this accord? I don't think so. I don't see signs of that. I didn't hear too many estimates saying that was happening. In fact, I think
what about the fact that 2 years ago China was setting up this separate banking system to try to get around doing business with if they had to live with the sanction regime, they would set up a separate banking system to do business with the U.S. and do business with Iran.
So I think that Secretary Kerry was actually quite explicit in saying that he felt that Russia and China were being more helpful in the talks recently than they had been in the past. Our EU partners certainly weren't threatening to walk away. When it comes to the banking,
more helpful to get an agreement.
Yes, absolutely.
So if
they
we
wanted
decide
agreement,
that
so
there's
did
not
we.
going to be an agreement,
But I don't think there was a threat from those members to walk away if it wasn't this deal. I think, frankly, this was mainly a negotiation at the end between Iran and the United States with the support of the P5+1 members.
so you feel if we reject this deal, that Russia, China, the P5 will hold on to the sanctions just as strongly, will go right back in there, will not be looking for ways to break away from the U.S. position?
So the situation obviously has changed now, because normally these countries really couldn't do this deal without U.S. participation, because they would need the United States to, say, lift the UN Security Council sanctions. The new UN Security Council resolution sort of locks that in. And so from my point of view, there are no easy scenarios here by any means, but there's really sort of two paths that could be taken. If the deal is disapproved here, they could either try to implement it anyway. The text of the agreement doesn't make it clear whether that could happen or not. But they could choose to simply go forward with it without U.S. participation when it comes to the sanctions waivers. They could also choose to walk away. I guess I would argue, Congressman, that if they walk away, if the Iranians walk away and choose to resume their nuclear activities, our allies were motivated to do this by their desire not to see Iran develop a nuclear weapon. I don't think that desire will suddenly go away out of pique at the Congress. And so I think they will have little choice but to then get back together with us and figure out, what do we do now? And I think that will look a lot like diplomacy and pressure in the way that it did before. Not that they'll be happy with us. Remember, we have had this situation in the past where we have walked away or another party has walked away, whether from these negotiations or another arms control agreement, like SALT II, for example, where generally the trend is if there's still the same interests at play, ultimately you resume a process of diplomacy. The banking system, I don't think, is in danger from China. I think that our prominence in the international financial system depends a lot on the role of the dollar as a sort of global reserve currency. And frankly, I don't see that as being under significant threat at this time. And so I don't think it's a matter of goodwill. I think it's a matter of the fact that the U.S. dollar enjoys that status. And so I don't think that the two things are quite as explicitly linked as that suggests.
Thank you. Anybody else wish to comment?
Mr. Ranking Member, it is true that the dollar has an unusual position of prominence now. I don't think that's guaranteed. I think the rise of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank with 50 founding members, including many close allies of the United States, is a sign of a potential for a different global financial role. And I think that in the event that the United States were seen to be going rogue, to seeking its own agreements above and beyond the international agreements, I think that would certainly drive China and other countries to devise some alternative way around the centrality that the U.S. Enjoys. I think one of the things that also is underappreciated in all of this is that the Russians and the Chinese have been unusually good team players since 2003 with the United States on the nuclear negotiations. We can talk about the possibility that this whole coalition would fray and fragment and everybody would go their own way, but it seems to me notable that we've actually been able to get quite good cooperation from countries with which we don't cooperate on a whole range of things. But on the Iranian nuclear deal, we have been working side by side with them for 12 years. I think we can count on continued support, and I worry that if we were to turn away, then we wouldn't have that support and we wouldn't be able to pick it up the way we've been building it for a dozen years.
Thank you. I've taken up a lot of time. I'll yield back.
Mr. Forbes.
Mr. Chairman, first of all, I want to thank you for having this hearing, thank our witnesses for being here, but it's amazing to me, you know, we're a nation that put a man on the moon, we built the Panama Canal, we revolutionized the computer technology, and what a low bar we now set for ourselves. We no longer have as our goal to have winning strategies. We no longer have as our goal to have the best deal we can get. We no longer have as our goal even to have a good deal. We seem to settle for a new standard, which is just the deal isn't as bad as it could be. And I know we have people that actually believe the government, when our government says if you want to keep your health care plan, you can keep your health care plan. And then when they don't, we just say, whoops, live with it. I know there are people that believe when the Syrian government says they're going to dispose of their chemical weapons and then they don't do it, and we just say, whoops, you have to live with it. I know there are people that believe when China says, give us your technology, we're going to use it for civilian purposes, we're not going to use it for the military. When we find out they use it for the military, they just say, whoops, you're going to live with it. Well, I firmly believe we're going to say whoops on this deal, you know, probably shorter time period rather than longer. So, Mr. Singh and Mr. Eisenstadt, can you tell me what the world's going to look like 5 years now with Iran in terms of this deal? Is it going to strengthen their economic situation or weaken their economic situation? And how is it going to strengthen it if it does? What with these assets can they do militarily to increase their military capabilities? And then the third thing, for our allies in that region, what concerns them most about this deal and what kind of implications is it going to have on them? So if you would just respond to any of those three.
Well, thank you, Congressman. I think that there's no doubt that Iran economically is better off with the deal than without the deal because of the lifting of sanctions or because of the unfreezing of their assets. It won't be a silver bullet for Iran. They still have economic problems related to mismanagement of the economy and so forth. But this will free up the space that they need to repair their economy, essentially. I think Dr. Alterman was right. The Iranian economy was in a very difficult state as a result, in part, of American and international sanctions. This relieves that pressure. In terms of how will they use this without build up, say, their military capabilities and the implications for the region, I do think that it's very significant that within 5 years the ban on imports of arms by Iran will be lifted. And then remember, under this agreement, there's a mechanism to actually allow arms transfers to Iran before that time. And so we're talking about Russia and China being with us. Russia and China are the largest providers of arms to Iran. One question I have is, if the Russians, as they've already said that they intend to, want to provide arms to Iran before that 5 years is up, it's up to the United States, essentially, to veto that in the Security Council. And so one question will be, are we willing to sort of brook these confrontations with Russia and China in the UN Security Council to stop literally every arms transfer to Iran within these 5 years? I don't know that the answer is an absolute yes. I would hope that we would do that, but I think that it'll depend upon the circumstances at the time. And then if you look at the question of arms exports, where Mr. Eisenstat's a bigger expert than I am on the question, there have been reports that groups like Hezbollah, groups like Palestinian Islamic Jihad have felt a financial squeeze in recent years, in part as a result of reduced Iranian assistance. I think that there is every prospect that that assistance could now grow under this agreement. While those arms transfers are prescribed, because those are terrorist groups and there's various laws prescribed, or I should say international resolutions prescribing such arms transfers, Iran hasn't abided by those in the past. And so again, it's a question of our will and our allies' will to address those types of things. And right now, my fear is that not only have we signed up to a deal that our allies will find insufficient, but we're not projecting that kind of will to stand up to Iranian activity in the region.
The only thing I'll add to that is, first of all, with the influx of unfrozen funds, keep in mind Iran has a pretty robust defense arms industry, and they'll probably increase procurement of the kind of weapons that they and their allies in Syria and Iraq and their proxies in Yemen need right now, and they'll increase exports of those weapons to enhance their allies' ability to prosecute the conflicts they're in now. The additional money also will be able to enable them to probably enhance or expand recruitment of proxies. Keep in mind, Iran's approach to warfare is what in the military realm is referred to as economy of force. They prefer to fight to the last proxy, the last Arab proxy, or now they've been recruiting Afghan Shiites and Pakistani Shiites. So more money will enable them to do more of that. And then finally, in terms of arms imports, the first thing I suspect they'll want to do is get the S-300 missiles when they can from Russia in order to provide an umbrella over their nuclear program to create the foundation so that if they want to go down the path of creating a clandestine parallel program, it'll be protected from preventive strike. And they'll also bury it and harden it as well. So.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Ms. Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for being here. As you can tell, obviously, everybody's very serious and intense in looking at these issues, and I appreciate your help. Dr. Alterman, and one of the questions that the ranking chair asked initially was this issue of legitimizing Iranian nuclear potential. Could you respond to that? And also in terms of the standing, both among our P5+1 partners and in the Middle Eastern countries as well. What do you see as the really problematic role around that? And what in the implementation plan that you spoke about we might be doing to ameliorate some of that?
I'm sorry, I'm not
First
sure I
on the
understand
legitimate
question of standing.
Pardon me?
I'm not sure I understand the question of standing. Do you mean Iran's standing in the region?
No, the U.S. standing
Oh.
among P5+1 and also the countries within the in the Middle East.
Okay.
But first on the legitimizing by virtue of the process that we've come to in this agreement.
Well, Iran is allowed by international law, by the treaties it signed, by the treaties we're a party to also, to have a domestic nuclear program. It's not allowed to have a nuclear weapons program. And what this agreement does is it brings Iran into fuller coordination with all of the international safeguards and standards of having a domestic program, which is not a weapons program. What I've heard directly from Secretary Moniz several times, who I think has probably forgotten more physics today than I will ever know in my life, is that we have spectacular capabilities to detect cheating, that nuclear products leave all sorts of remnants that we will be able to detect. We understand a tremendous amount about the way the Iranian system works because we have been trying to understand the system along with our allies for decades. And he has relative confidence as a nuclear physicist that a combination of having an allowed pathway with all sorts of international standards and safeguards and processes that the world has developed over decades, combined with the inspections, combined with our covert capabilities, that we are going to retain a very good understanding of where the Iranians are, whether the Iranians are cheating. The question which Mr. Eisenstadt raised, which is an absolutely valid one, is what happens when they cheat? And I can't imagine there's not going to be some effort to see, is anybody really serious about this? And to my mind, that's really where the role of Congress comes in. The goal of this is to have the best agreement possible. The goal of this is to keep Iran from developing a nuclear weapon. The decision before Congress is this adequate to meet that goal? And it seems to me that it is adequate to meet the goal, and this is something that we have worked very closely with our allies on, that they have trusted us to follow through, and I'm really worried that if we, in their minds, abdicate the leadership that we've taken in this agreement, that we're going to be fighting the very same problems from a much, much weaker position than we would have. And the job of Congress, the decisions Congress will face, will be much more difficult decisions than we face now.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. On the standing issue, it sounds like then you would refute the notion that somehow by creating the question here really is there a pathway or is there not? Or is it something that is so problematic that it, after 5 years or 10 years and certainly into the 15-year period, that something that certainly Israel is going to be very, very fearful of?
It seems to me that if there comes a point where the Iranians decide that all of their commitments don't mean anything, that they really do want to have a bomb, that any of those negative possibilities, let's say we get to that point, in what position do we want to be at that point? Do we want to be alone? Do we want to be in a head-to-head confrontation with the Iranians? Or do we want to be standing with the world, with all the economies, all the people Iran trades with, and say, if you go down that road, there will be severe consequences for everything you care about, or you can continue to comply. I think there's partly a bet in this that over time, as the Iranians decide they like being integrated with the world, they'll want to continue to be integrated with the world. But even if that bet doesn't play out, even if it doesn't produce better Iranian behavior, to my mind, we want the world with us and not the world saying, you guys are maximalists and we can't deal, you're both maximalists. We don't want to deal with either one of you. It doesn't matter. I don't think that's the position the United States wants to be in.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Chairman Miller.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to the witnesses. We appreciate your testimony. You're obviously very well educated, and I hope you'll allow me to ask, because I'm a pretty simple guy, not a doctor, some pretty simple questions. In yes or no, I think we'll answer most of them. Would unfettered access have made this a better deal?
Well, sure, absolutely. Unfettered access would make it a better deal.
If one could get that deal, that would be great.
Dr. Altman, you said that Iran is not a near peer, and I concur. But my question is, would this agreement elevate them closer to near peer status? And what if China and Russia infuse conventional military capabilities? Does that move them closer to a near peer status?
Sir, as I said, there's somewhere right now in GDP between Maryland and Washington State. That still leaves them a considerable way to go. As I said, it's remarkable over the last dozen years how much Iran has been an issue of cooperation between the U.S., Russia, and China. And I'm not sure, as an analytical point, it's wise to make a premise that Russia and China will seek to use Iran as a club against the United States rather than continue the path that they've been following for a dozen years.
Can any of you think of a way that the administration can guarantee that the lifted sanctions would not be used to finance international terrorism?
Well, Congressman, let me also address the previous question.
No, that's, if you would, just answer my question.
Of course, although I think that's the wrong way to look at it, the way that Dr. Alterman put it, because I think that the question isn't, will Iran somehow match the United States? Of course not. Iran is not going to reach that level, there's no doubt. But can Iran use, as you suggested, the considerable amount of money that it's going to receive as a result of this agreement and increased oil exports to further finance proxies? It could certainly spend more than the United States is willing to spend in Iraq, for example. The billion plus that we've spent right now in the Iraq Train and Equip mission, for example, Iran could easily spend far more than that. And we do have, absolutely, sanctions and laws against that would target Iranian support for terrorism, and those aren't being lifted under this accord. But practically speaking, the effect of the sanctions mean that Iran will have a lot more money to use, and it'll be up to us to try to plug those holes, and that'll be difficult.
Okay, could you answer the question I asked?
That last part was the answer to your question, sir, that Iran will have far more assets to use.
Let's go to this. Would it be easier for Iran to get weapons to Hamas and Hezbollah, or easier for them to get money for them to buy weapons?
Yeah, right now, the Israelis enforce a blockade of Gaza. So getting in weapons, they can't. Money's a lot easier, and many times there are reports of people coming in with suitcases and the like. And also Iran provides them with blueprints for how to use, how to make better rockets and the like. Hezbollah, they have more options. They're able to get both arms and money to Hezbollah, and both are important for Hezbollah. So our ability to, even though despite the fact that there is a UN resolution 1701, which proscribes Iran from arming Hezbollah, Hezbollah started the last war in 2006 with, I think, 20,000, 25,000 missiles and rockets. They have now 80 to 100,000, and that's largely due to Iranian largesse. So our efforts have not been succeeding, and it's going to only get worse in the future now.
And I apologize, my time is very short, and I'd like any of you to answer this question. And again, I apologize, it's a very simple question. Secretary Kerry is quoted in the press saying, "I'm absolutely convinced beyond any doubt this deal makes Israel safer." If that is a true statement, why is Israel opposed to the deal?
Yeah, I would just note that it's not just the government, but it's also the opposition in Israel, which is opposed. And there's wide, I think, consensus on that. And I guess it's a matter of where you stand, depends upon where you sit. And they're a lot closer to the problem.
Dr. Alterman?
Yeah.
Congressman, my testimony talks somewhat about Israeli politics. It seems to me there's a political opposition that's very strong in Israel for Israeli political reasons. In my judgment, the Israeli security establishment is much more mixed, and several senior retired heads of Mossad, Shin Bet, and other organizations have argued in favor of the agreement.
Mr. Larson.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to underscore Dr. Alterman's last point about the variety of opinion in Israel. I think within the government and opposition, there isn't variety. Outside of the government and the official opposition, there is a wider variety of opinion on the deal, none of which we have a lot of influence over, which is why we are having this discussion here about what our opinions are. Dr. Alterman, the issue about Syrian and Iranian weapons inspections has come up. Some of us have an opportunity later this afternoon to meet with a former weapons inspector. Can you give us your assessment of an an apples to apples comparison and what the apples to oranges comparison is. Do you have a view on that?
I have tremendous respect for all the weapons inspectors I've met. They tend to be spectacular scientists. They're meticulous in what they do. It makes all of the investigators I've ever met in the United States pale by comparison, because this really is about getting every detail down. I therefore do not feel comfortable telling you how much of this is apples, how much is oranges, how much is a combination. It certainly matters that you have a war zone versus not a war zone. It certainly matters that I think the intelligence communities have spent much more time trying to understand the Iranian program than trying to understand the Syrian program. It certainly matters that there are more trace elements involved in a nuclear program than there are in a chemical weapons program. But if you're interested, I can certainly put you in touch with some tremendous people who are arms control experts, both at CSIS and at other institutions, who can help prep you for this afternoon's meeting.
I value that. I don't have time before the meeting, but we have another many days and weeks before we have to make a decision on this. So, Dr. Singh, or is it doctor? Is it Mr.? Can you be clearer a little bit more about what you assess Iran's options are for use of additional revenue beyond supporting terrorism, but including supporting terrorism, and then assess what the likelihood, if you can give me a likelihood about how they might use that.
So money is fungible. They'll get somewhere between $50 to $150 billion. Secretary Liu, the Treasury Secretary, has said that a good portion of that is already tied up in some overseas projects. So let's say it's $50 billion for the sake of this answer. My expectation is that, like just about every other country, given additional revenue, Iran will spend it in a variety of ways, and these aren't mutually exclusive. I would expect they'd use some for domestic purposes and some for foreign policy concerns. If you look at the 2013 budget that President Rouhani put in, there were some increases on domestic accounts, but also a very substantial increase on military spending, security spending. The IRGC's budget went up considerably, and the Ministry of Intelligence and Security's budget went up considerably. There's a good reason not to repatriate all the funds right away, because that would have an inflationary effect inside Iran if suddenly in a $400 billion economy you added $50 billion. So there's a macroeconomic reason to keep some of it overseas. That could either then be used for regional sort of foreign policy concerns, or you could use it to purchase investments overseas, or any other number of things. I don't think we can know with certainty exactly what Iran will do, but we have to assume it'll be a variety of things. And a little goes a long way when it comes to the regional stuff.
Yeah. Sorry, it's time. Yeah.
If I could just make a comment about the apples and oranges comparison. And I just wanted to get back to the Iraq inspections, because I think it's important to mention that why I think in many ways there are some aspects of the Iraqi inspections that are relevant, but many that are not. First, Iraq in the 90s was a defeated country, and the international community had a lot of leverage. Iran sees itself now as a rising power. We were willing to use force to support weapons inspections in the 90s in Iraq. We're not willing to really put out the threat of the military option and to articulate it in a way that I think is credible in Iranian eyes today. And back then, Iraq was sanctioned, and they were not able to rebuild their industrial infrastructure, so you had pretty much a static baseline that we were trying to inspect. Iran, as a result of all the funds they're going to be getting, will be able to have all kinds of industrial projects in which they can hide a clandestine program.
How much more clearer can we be when we say we still maintain, we keep all options on the table?
It's a very passive formulation, I would just argue, and the Iranians mock it all the time.
Anyone's free to mock that. I'm pretty sure we're serious about it.
But it comes in the back against the background of the Syrian CW Red Line incident. That's all.
Mr. Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your leadership, and thank you for your very thoughtful presentation earlier today on Fox News, explaining the issues that we're facing right now. And I appreciate the panel being here today. Mr. Singh, there is bipartisan opposition to the nuclear deal. I was grateful 2 weeks ago at a Foreign Affairs Committee meeting to be present with Senator Joe Lieberman of Connecticut, where he expressed opposition to the deal, and in fact, he indicated that there needed to be an override in the event of a veto. I expressed to him my concern, quote, that the Secretary of State designated Iran a state sponsor of terrorism January the 23rd, 1984, over 30 years ago. This was in response to the October 1983 bombing of the U.S. Marine barracks in Beirut, killing hundreds of U.S. Marines, end of quote. Subsequently, I asked Senator Lieberman, has there been any change of course by this regime leading up to the negotiations? Senator Lieberman made a chilling response, I believe. Quote, this Iranian government, the Islamic Republic of Iran, has the blood of a lot of Americans on its hands. The Marines at the barracks in Beirut, the soldiers at Khobar Towers. I could go on and on. Incidentally, hundreds of American soldiers were killed in Iraq by Shia militias that were trained in Iran by the IRGC. So your question is a good one. Has the government changed? There is no evidence of it, end of quote. Mr. Singh, do you believe there's been any change prior to the execution of this agreement?
I don't see that change, Congressman. I don't see any evidence to suggest that there has been a kind of strategic shift. We still see Iran actively supporting proxies in Syria, Iraq, Yemen, and elsewhere. We still see them funding terrorism. That was clarified by the State Department recently when it released its terrorism report.
And incredibly, yesterday, Congressman Berman indicated that support of terrorism continues with the Houthis, with Hezbollah, with Hamas. And as he correctly stated, that's just terrorist groups that begin with the letter H. And so people should know this. Additionally, Mr. Eisenstadt, what role do you believe the estimated $150 billion infusion to the Iranian economy will play in their well-documented support of terrorist activities in Syria, in Gaza, in Lebanon, in Yemen, and worldwide? And what type of beneficial impact would $150 billion have on the Iranian economy, and what mechanisms are instituted by the U.S. to prevent any use of the funds for destabilization or terrorist activities?
Yeah. Well, again, I think they'll be able to provide money to their allies throughout the region, which they can use in turn to buy arms, for patronage networks, for, in the case of those who have are involved in politics, such as Hezbollah, to provide additional funds for their support base, which ensures their popularity. So I think it'll, and also, we've seen at least reports recently that as a result of sanctions of the last 2 years, they've had to cut back financing or aid to groups such as Hezbollah and Hamas, and that'll be able to reverse that trend of the last few years.
And as we look at Hamas and Hezbollah, could you give an estimate of the number of rockets that have been provided to those terrorists directed at Israel?
Yeah, Hamas, a lot of the rockets are homemade, although they are supplemented by both Syrian and I think Iranian rockets, although I don't have the number of the breakdown between the two. And I think Hamas, at the end of the last war, they started the war with 10,000, and the Israelis believe they destroyed about 2/3 of it. But we know they've been showing videos that they've been rebuilding. Hezbollah, the estimate is about 80 to 100,000. A lot of those are Iranian or Syrian. Again, I don't have really a breakdown of that. But to a large extent, Iran has been providing the wherewithal for the way of war as practiced by these partners.
And Dr. Alterman, according to Human Rights Watch, in 2014, Iran had the second highest number of executions in the world and executed the largest number of juvenile offenders. The country remains one of the biggest jailers in the world of journalists, bloggers, and social media activists, 46 behind bars now. What message does this deal send to human rights violators around the world?
Congressman, I have friends who've been imprisoned in Iran. I take that all very seriously. I take the human rights considerations very seriously. The goal of some people in Iran is if Iran becomes more integrated in the world, then the world's standards will get more integrated into Iran. There will be incentives for Iran to behave. There will be incentives for Iran not to be an area of instability because companies won't want to invest in areas of instability.
Mr. Courtney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to the witnesses for being here today. Dr. Alterman, I particularly appreciate in your testimony on pages 2 and 3, you directly sort of focused on this committee's jurisdiction in terms of obviously arming our national security system and the role that this Congress can play if, let's just hypothetically agree that the agreement does go into effect, as far as shaping the perception of our the Gulf Arab states in particular, that we are committed to their security and also to restraining Iran. And you talked about in your testimony that overall force structure, basing, arms sales, and training all have a profound effect on these countries' estimates of U.S. intentions and U.S. commitments, and I would argue that a very large number of these decisions come through this committee. So looking today, where we've got the Fifth Fleet in Bahrain, the Sixth Fleet in the Mediterranean, we have bases in Qatar. You know, we actually did intercept an Iranian arms shipment on its way to Yemen last April with the USS Theodore Roosevelt. I mean, are these sort of some of the components of trying to shape that perception and of our commitment to pushing back against Iranian aggression in the region?
Sir, there are any number of things. We have bases not just in Manama for the Fifth Fleet and in Qatar for CENTCOM. We have U.S. military bases in all of the GCC countries, save Saudi Arabia. We have requests from allies for all kinds of weapon systems. And their argument to us has been, we are fighting alongside you in Syria. We're fighting alongside you in Iraq. Why is it so hard to get resupplied for the fight that we're in together? The Emiratis will tell you, as they've told me, that we fought alongside you in 11 wars. And we would like more signs of friendship as we try to defend ourselves. It's not my role to give you a list of what the allies have requested to show that we are committed to them or to love them. But it seems to me that if you're looking at the U.S. position in the Middle East, our allies fear that we're looking to get out. That I got emails from Chinese scholars this week who said, we think you cut a soft deal on Iran because you want to get out of the Middle East and pivot to Asia. And that makes us worried. I told him, of course, that if all of our Asian allies weren't so concerned about China, they would be less concerned with getting us out there. But I think that there are any number of things we can do to send signals of what we care about, to send signals of what we're committed to. A tremendous number of those come through this committee. I think it's a very constructive area of engagement for this committee to discuss.
And Secretary Kerry, as he testified yesterday, I mean, is on his way to Doha in a few days to really sort of, I guess, enhance that discussion or dialogue, which, again, I think almost regardless of what Congress does, that's something that we need to sort of be focused on, particularly, again, in this committee. Last question I just have is, nothing in this agreement takes the military alternative off the table for this Congress or this country today or 15 years from today.
Sir, not only does it not take it off the table, but it also doesn't excuse any Iranian behavior. It doesn't give the Iranians any carte blanche to do anything in the region. All those things remain on the table. This is a narrowly derived agreement to focus on the threat of Iran developing a nuclear weapon with which it would both threaten U.S. allies and kick off proliferation throughout the region, which, in the judgment of many people, would not contribute to regional stability.
I mean, it seems like a fairly obvious point, but sometimes I think it's sort of lost in some of the discussion here. And I would just say, again, that I checked the DoD manifest over the last couple of days, where we have been flying about 30 to 40 airstrikes a day just this week off, again, our carrier that's stationed over there, and now with Turkey, there's going to be more. So the notion that somehow this country is just sort of standing by in the Middle East and wringing its hands, passive, I think was the quote that was used earlier. I frankly just think people should sometimes sort of check the basic facts about what our military is actually doing and where it's stationed. And I would yield back.
Chairman Klein.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to the witnesses. We hear the term, and we've heard it here today, and we use it all the time, in the region. And I was in the region back in March, right before Easter, and had wonderful opportunity to visit with leaders in Jordan and Saudi Arabia, for example, earlier to visit with leaders in the Emirates.
And in this trip, remember this is the March timeframe when the deal was much being talked about, but when it wasn't the deal. What I heard repeatedly from our Arab friends was a great deal of concern about what Iran was doing. And as we know, we don't know, but when I was there, this was the fourth day when I was in Riyadh. It was the fourth day of the bombing strikes that the Saudis and others were conducting in Yemen against the Houthis. So there was a great deal of distrust everywhere we went about Iran and what their activities were and what this deal might yield. When we were in Riyadh and talking to the Minister of Defense, who happens to be the king's son, he said to us as we were leaving this meeting, when you see the Israelis, tell them they're right. And this is in the context of Iran. So, and you look at this deal, which allows an infusion of some unspecified amount of money between 50 and 150 billion. I think Mr. Singh, you said, and I think I heard Secretary Liu use some number like 56 billion or something like that. That's a lot of money in the region. I guess I'm looking for some sort of sense for those of you in Near East policy, I guess Mr. Singh and Mr. Eisenstadt, over what are our friends, what are the Arabs, what are the Egyptians, the Saudis, the Emiratis, the Jordanians, what are they now saying, thinking about this deal? Are they safer? Are they less safe? Is Israel safer, less safe? Please.
Well, Congressman, I think that the concerns that our allies in the region have are not just about this deal, but they're about our overall policy in the region predating the deal. I think they worry that we're no longer strategically on the same page. And that's why when we talk about what do we do from here, it's fine to talk about assistance in tangible ways to allies. It's fine to talk about a robust American military presence in the region. It's fine to talk about sort of intel resources and making sure that we're keeping a close eye on the Iranians. But none of those are really, I think, get at the core concern of allies, which is that strategically we're not in the same place because they see us countering ISIS, and of course they welcome that, but they don't see us countering Iranian proxies, whether in Iraq or in Syria, for example. You see, for example, this recent story about a safe zone in northern Syria where it looked like we might be willing to sort of more actively take on the Assad regime, and then it seems like we're backing off of that, although maybe that's just sort of a garbling of a news story. And so I think they feel that we're just not strategically on the same page, and so they'll accept this assistance, absolutely. They'll accept the increase in exercises, but they worry about fundamentally, are we going in different directions, as Dr. Alterman said? Are we looking to simply disengage or realign ourselves? And I think that's what we need to convince them that, in fact, that's not happening. And that's why I've written that one of the problems with this agreement is that it's not nested in any sort of coherent strategy for the region, and in fact, it seems at odds with our stated strategy in the region. That gives rise to suspicions.
If I could just add to that and build on it. I agree. I mean, it comes against the background of the perception among many of our friends in the region that we invaded Iraq, and either through by design or incompetence, we handed it over to the Shiites in Iran, and the perception that we threw President Mubarak under the bus. Although, frankly, I'm not sure what other option we had at that point, but to switch horses. So some of the problems are are longstanding. The rebalancing to Asia, and then this with creating the perception that we have a tacit kind of arrangement with the Islamic Republic to empower them in order to create some kind of balance in the region. So it just kind of feeds these kind of fears and perceptions. But let me just also say, look, I mean, one of the things that our allies are most concerned about, because they are dealing with proxy wars and the like around them, and from the point of view of both Israel and our Gulf allies, they see themselves being encircled by Iran and their proxies, is that this agreement, again, as we've talked, frees up a lot of funds which will enable these activities. Plus, as I mentioned before, 5 years from now, as the arms embargo on transfers to Iran is lifted, they'll be able to get S-300 missiles. If not sooner, that will foreclose some of, or at least constrain some of our military options, so that even though maybe the military option is technically on the table, it'll be much harder as a result of things that we've agreed to. And the final point I just wanted to make is that no agreement is self-implementing. You have to have a conducive policy context in order for it to succeed. And that's why Mr. Singh and myself have argued that we need to push back against Iranian activities in the region in order to show them that they will be less inclined to cheat in the nuclear accord. Because if there is a more permissive regional environment, they'll be more inclined to cheat in the nuclear accord.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Ms. Songas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for pulling together this set of people to testify, and I appreciate your testimony because I think we all recognize that we are at a real crossroads, that it is a historic moment reflective of a deep commitment this country has made to finding a way forward to constrain Iran from developing a nuclear weapon. And so it's very important, I think, and I think you see here that we're all taking advantage of your testimony to really ask some of the hard questions that I think we all have to be comfortable with as we make our decisions going forward. And so, number one, I think much of the discussion has sort of strayed away from the goal of the agreement, and the goal of that agreement, of this agreement, as set out by Secretary Kerry, President Obama, Secretary Moniz, who was so much a part of it, was to prevent Iran from developing a nuclear weapon, at least for the next 10 to 15 years. And I think much of our discussion has sort of strayed from that to focus more on the impact of sanctions relief, the kind of funding opportunities that it will present. And in that context, Mr. Singh, I appreciate that you sort of validated the $50 billion figure that Secretary Liu has put out there as a reasonable number that might be made available to Iran. Not a small one, but we've heard much larger numbers. So as we have this discussion, I think it's good that it's rooted in what really is possible. But I wanted to get to you, Mr. Alterman, because you have said that it's an adequate deal, that in the context of preventing Iran from developing a nuclear weapon for the next 10 to 15 years, that it is adequate to holding Iran accountable. But you've also said in your written statement the success or failure of the agreement hinges on implementation, and I think we all know that. Many of our questions do revolve around that. So can you tell me in your mind what the key factors are to a successful implementation, what that would look like? We've heard some concerns about the human dimension, that in the end it's up to people, part of the IAEA, sort of making decisions as to how to move forward where they suspect that there's some shenanigans going on. So we can never get away from that altogether. That's the nature of this agreement in general, any agreement in general. But what do you see successful implementation hinging upon going forward?
Congresswoman, it seems to me there are two aspects to this. One is that you can keep the countries that are enforcing this agreement intent on enforcing the agreement. That if somebody sees something that is distressing, that the countries will act together to investigate something distressing and be determined to hold the Iranians to account for that. That, of course, comes in a whole complex set of relationships that we all have with each other and other kinds of interests. But again, I think the last dozen years, we've worked reasonably closely on this. The Russians and the Chinese haven't gone their own way. And so I'm cautiously optimistic, although certainly not certain, that we can keep this inspection side moving. The other piece, of course, is what the Iranians decide to do. And in my studies of Iran, it seems to me that we often assume that they don't really have politics, that we assume they don't have factions, that we assume there's one guy with a beard in a room making all the decisions. And the more I understand about Iran, the more I understand they have brutal politics. People fighting for resources, people fighting for power, people fighting for influence. I think one of the uncertainties in all of this is, are there ways that this deal would lead to more constructive Iranian politics that would lead to more constructive Iranian behavior? And that's certainly a hope of this deal. I'm not sure it's necessary, but I think one of the promises of the deal is that you can create enough incentives for people who want Iran to be much more of a normal state, much less of a revolutionary cause, to have more influence in Iran.
What do you see Congress's role being in encouraging the successful implementation of this?
And I think also making clear that if Iran is to improve its behavior, that American companies would feel much freer to go into Iran. And if Iran is playing games, then Congress would be very serious about not allowing American companies to go in. In my conversations with people in oil companies, one of the interesting things is just how conscious they are of exactly where the legal line is for what they can talk about, what they'd want to do in Iran. And they keep that line very bright and very far away from anything they want to say or do. And I think that is helpful. And the Iranians should know that we're paying attention to what they do, and we will act accordingly.
Thank you. My time is up.
I thank the gentlelady. Thank all of you for being here today. I think it's probably important at times to just back up and consider just the sweep of military history and the fact that we're over 70 years into the nuclear age now. And we find ourselves in a moment when one of our primary foundations for security in this country is our nuclear deterrent. It's based on a principle that if someone should attack us, that the response would be unacceptable to them. In other words, the fact that our military capability is on the table if someone attacks us. And in this situation, I feel like that's probably the fundamental mistake that was made in this agreement, that Iran never really feared a military being on the table, a military response. And I'm convinced that that was because they had to watch this president as ISIS beheaded its way across Iraq, and they knew they had nothing to fear from him. With that in context, I would suggest that whatever the cost is of preventing Iran from gaining nuclear weapons, it will pale in insignificance, or pale in comparison to the cost of dealing with Iran once it has a nuclear weapons capability. Mr. Alderman, you suggested that Iran was writhing in pain, to use your words, and that this situation was not going to really change that a great deal. But I would suggest that North Korea, when we dealt with them, they were even more economically disadvantaged. And yet we made a deal with them that occurs to me was much more robust than this one, much more favorable, and the result was that Korea gained nuclear weapons a few years later. Mr. Singh, I want to point my question directly to you, sir. You laid out three prime components to the nuclear weapons capability. One was the fissile material, the ability to enrich and have fissile material. The second one was to weaponize, and the third was to have a delivery system. Given that 2 and 3 in circumstances could be accomplished in fairly rudimentary ways, the real fundamental mechanism here is the gaining of fissile material, or the ability to have indigenous enrichment or plutonium production. And under this agreement, where the Iranians now have 19,000 centrifuges, mostly IR-1s, they would back off to 5,000 to 6,000 centrifuges. Yet they have the, under a protected protocol, the ability to enhance to IR-8s. Would you tell this committee how much more capable an IR-8 is compared to an IR-1, how much that then would compare to their existing capability, and also would you tell us if one part of Iran's nuclear infrastructure has been or will be destroyed under this agreement?
Well, thank you, Congressman. The IR-8 centrifuge you refer to, the Iranians have claimed it's 16 times more powerful than their existing IR-1 centrifuges. The IR-1 centrifuge is an antiquated design. It would take far more of them operating for longer compared to the IR-8 to make one bomb's worth of uranium. How efficient it'll actually be in practice, we don't know, because we haven't seen it in practice yet. But one concern that you might have about this agreement is that it actually creates a safe space for the Iranians to continue the testing of the IR-6 and the IR-8, and then after 8.5 years, begin deploying those centrifuges in Cascades, and after 10 years, totally swapping out the IR-1s. And as I said, this is tremendously concerning because if you wanted to have a clandestine nuclear facility that was small, you'd want to use these more advanced centrifuges to do that. I'm also concerned about them getting international assistance with the centrifuges. There are various stopgaps against that, but that's going to be something we're going to have to pay a lot of attention to in this agreement. Is anything dismantled in this agreement? I would say they're left in possession of their entire nuclear infrastructure. Their heavy water reactor is going to be modified with a new core. Their centrifuges will be deactivated in part, but those are limits which expire after a period of 10 to 15 years. So you're talking about temporary freezes on certain parts of it, but not really a dismantling.
Well, I guess my time is almost up, so I would just suggest that the great concern that some of us have, not only the danger to Israel, but the utter unenforceability of this agreement. And I hope that somehow the American Congress will respond in a way that would give us the best chance going forward to seeing our children walk in the light of freedom. And with that, I'm going to recognize Mr. Vesey for his questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wanted to ask Dr. Alterman and Mr. Singh specifically about stretching out the inspections. There has been some concerns raised that perhaps these inspections could be stretched out. Like, for instance, let's say that there is and Mr. Unstead, I would definitely like your opinion too as well, if you would like to weigh in. If there's a site that that inspectors feel need to be examined, of course, you know, with the 24-day rule that's put in place, will the Iranians be able to, you know, offer any sort of explanations or any sort of delay mechanisms to stop that 24 days from being, you know, fully enforced? Because and the reason I was wanting to know that was because I, as someone that is thinking about, you know, how I may ultimately vote on this, I want to know, is this 24-day number something that's firm?
Congress, my understanding from the briefings I've gotten from Secretary Moniz and others is that it is, and it is adequate, because the radioactivity and the traces that these materials leave behind cannot be eliminated within 24 days or even a little bit longer. I think they've repaved the Parchin site 6 times in order to try to cover up evidence of what they've done before. They've done that over years. What I've heard from the nuclear experts I've spoken to is that this window is sufficiently small that if something prohibited has been going on, there will be sufficient residue that our capabilities will pick up.
But I mean, but absent any sort of you know, them trying to clean up a particular site that may have contained radioactive materials, do you feel that the 24-day rule that's in place, that it means 24 days and that it can't be stretched out? The Iranians can't say, oh well, wait, hold on a second, we want you to send us something in writing. We want to have an opportunity to go and look at this a little bit longer.
Every arms control expert I've spoken to, and there have been more than a dozen, have all told me that they feel that that provision is sufficiently specific and rigorous enough to give people clarity.
Well, I have a different view, and I've actually, Ali Hanonen, who was in charge of verification for the IAEA, has said the same thing. So there are arms control experts who have said this isn't sufficient. Part of the reason is that the 24-day period is preceded by a back and forth between Iran and the IAEA. The IAEA needs to ask Iran to clarify any suspect activity. That's an indefinite process. We don't know exactly how long that lasts. If the IAEA is not satisfied, then the formal access request is made. That starts a 24-day clock. If after 24 days that joint commission says, Iran, you've got to give access, Iran could still say no, and we'd have to take them to a dispute resolution mechanism. That dispute resolution mechanism could last anywhere from 30 to 35 days and could be extended by consensus of the joint commission, which would have to include the United States, bear in mind. If Iran still says no at the end of that, then it goes to the Security Council, and the question is, do you want to collapse the entire agreement over this issue? And then I think everyone, including the United States, is going to have to look real hard at that request for access and say, is it worth it? Now, when it comes to radioactive elements, here, look, the question is the work in question work that was being done with nuclear material? There is nuclear weapons design work that could be done without nuclear weapons material, in which case this issue is not relevant to this question. And even if you detect traces of material, if they've had that time to demolish the site, the question is, what specifically can you actually tell about what was going on at that site, beyond the fact that there was nuclear material there? And so I don't think we should take that as sort of a silver bullet. It certainly hasn't been in the past when it comes to inspections.
If I could just add to that, to build on Mr. Singh's comments, I agree with John in that we have very, very sensitive technologies to detect nuclear materials. It's something like a billionth of a part can be detected, and very often years and sometimes decades later. And it's very hard to sanitize those sites. But that's only one subset of the type of nuclear activities that we would want to prevent. Now, if somebody's doing nuclear computer modeling and stuff, they could get rid of the evidence in as long as it takes to pull out the hard drive and take it home and put it in a different hard drive. And it would be very hard to stop that. If you're dealing with the manufacture of non-nuclear components for a weapon, well, that would take a bit longer. That might take maybe a couple of days to clean up or so. It all depends on exactly what kind of activity you're talking about. So it would have been preferable to have a much smaller time window to be able to detect more than just stuff related to radioactive materials and the like.
It's interesting. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Whitman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to thank our witnesses for joining us today. Mr. Singh, Mr. Eisenstadt, I'd like to propose to you 3 questions that get you to give us your perspective. We've been told that this choice is between the deal before us versus going to war. I want to get your perspective. Is that truly the only choices that we have in this? And we're also told that this is the best deal we can get. Is this truly the case? Is this the best deal that we can get? Dr. Alterman also said that in his testimony that it was an adequate deal and that Congress could subsequently go back and fix things that might be a problem from the adequate deal. Can you give us your perspective on how Congress has performed in fixing things that it has put in place that are less than adequate?
Well, look, on the first question, is this really a choice between deal and war, the deal on the table and war? I think that's a false choice, frankly. The United States, ultimately, obviously, we decide when we go to war. I don't see any preparations for doing that. I didn't detect that in President Obama's policy. If it was really a choice between this deal and war, the Iranians may still reject this deal, which means we should all be preparing ourselves for some pretty nasty options. I think that underestimates the deterrent power of the United States. Yes, the Iranians could rush forward for a weapon if we walk away from this, or they could in any circumstance. In the past, they haven't done that. They've been deliberate, they've been slow, in part, I think, because of the deterrent power of the United States. We've said if they do that, there will be this military option. In fact, I would say that the downplaying of our deterrent options and the alternatives and the consequences for Iran helped us get into what was a relatively weak negotiating position. Is this the best deal we can get? As I said in my written testimony, I think that we could have gotten a stronger agreement. I think you could argue, well, that's water under the bridge now. We have the deal that we have. And so could we get a stronger agreement in the future? I think that there's no easy scenario for that. I think now it's quite difficult, having gone to the UN Security Council, to endorse this particular deal. But, frankly, I would say the question is really, do it now or do it later? Because once these restrictions start expiring, we're going to need to have some sort of new policy anyway. Unless the Iranian strategy changes, which, as I said, we haven't seen any evidence for, we're going to be worrying about this in 5 to 10 to 15 years and confronting this problem yet again without those constraints.
The only thing I would add to that is, first of all, I don't know if we could have gotten a better deal, but because that's a kind of a counterfactual. But I could point to, in fact, I wrote a whole monograph about how the U.S. could better marshal all the instruments of national power to increase leverage over Iran in the negotiations. So, and there were a lot of, I think there's a number of instruments that we didn't use as effectively as we could have. So it stands to measure, stands to reason that had we more effectively used the leverage we had, in particular, one of those had to do with a credible military threat, which I don't think really was on the table. I think we may have come out with a better deal. Again, it's counterfactual. In terms of can Congress fix it? I mean, actually, You know, I think it is probably too late to do intrusive kind of surgery because, as Mr. Singh has said, you know, there's already a UN Security Council resolution, and I don't think politics will allow that. But I think the role that Congress can play is forcing the administration to create, as I mentioned before, that conducive political context, whereby, again, if Iran believes that that the regional environment it is operating in is permissive, it will also believe that it will have more latitude to perhaps push back in terms of its observance of the agreement and perhaps cheat. And if the regional environment is less conducive and we are pushing back at Iranian activities throughout the region, that will be a signal to them that, and hopefully will deter them from challenging the agreement, because there's a lot of ambiguity. If you look at this text, I've never read, I read UN Security Council resolutions all the time. I read these kind of documents all the time. It is the most convoluted, opaque document I've ever read in my life. And there will be differences in interpretation. And that's why it's very important that the United States and its partners in this agreement clarify this is our understanding of what Iran has committed to, and therefore they can't, you know, so that they cannot engage in wedge strategies to play us off against each other down the road when people have moved on for the jobs and nobody remembers exactly what was agreed to. We've got to nail this down now.
Gotcha.
And that's where Congress, I think, can be constructive. That's one area.
Gotcha. Mr. Singh, within that context, give me your historical perspective about how successful Congress has been in coming back to these issues where there's been these problems with the adequacy of what's been passed here. The Congress's record of coming back and truly fixing those things. Just give me your perspective in that, or maybe an example about where you've seen that either successful or not successful.
Well, I'm not an expert when it comes to the history of arms control agreements. I will say, though, that obviously revising them after the fact can be difficult. I mean, look at the Conventional Forces in Europe Treaty, where we have tried to fix it in the face of Russian aggression in Georgia and Ukraine. That hasn't been terribly successful. And I think it is quite tough to change these things after the fact once we're in them.
Mr. Rourke.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Alterman, I'd like to continue the conversation about the credibility of a military threat from the U.S. One, I'd like to know how you think Iran would respond if we were more explicit about sign this deal under more ideal, with a more ideal standard than the one we currently have, or else we will invade. And then I'd like you to address this concern that our military threat is not credible enough. It's hard for me to understand, considering that we invaded the country to Iran's immediate west and changed that regime. We invaded the country to Iran's immediate east and changed that regime at the cost of hundreds of billions of dollars, thousands of U.S. service member lives, and hundreds of thousands of lives lost in those two countries. So I'd like you to begin by addressing that credibility of a military threat. And then I'd just add that this president has made it clear that no option, including a military one, is off the table. There's not a single member of Congress who would say that the military option's off the table, and not a single presidential candidate in the current primaries who would say that. So tell me how this message is being lost on Iran, if that's in fact the case.
My reading from talking to Iranians is they don't doubt Americans' capabilities to do anything anywhere around the world. The question they're confronting is the American will to do things. The question they're confronting is, after an open-ended war in Iraq, which accomplished a fraction of American goals, after the longest war in American history in Afghanistan, is the U.S. really prepared to invade Iran, to occupy the country and impose a different regime? Members of this committee may have different views on that. I assume that your constituents all have different views on that. But if that is what people think we should be telling the Iranians, that if you don't make this deal, we're going to occupy your country, throw out your government, and impose somebody we like better, I think the Iranians would judge whether the United States really wants to do that or not. The other side of the spectrum is the U.S. can strike anything, anywhere, at any time with impunity. And we've been doing it in Syria and Iraq for the last year. And the question is, if you do that, how much difference does that make? And then in between those things, how do you use military instruments to get political objectives? And I think any country struggles with the challenge of how to use military tools for political outcomes, and we've done it sometimes successfully, we've done it sometimes unsuccessfully. But the Iranians, I think, look at all these questions with a fair degree of sophistication. I think they evaluate the threats, they evaluate what they think our intentions are, and they do it with a remarkable degree of sophistication that we don't apply to their system. There are a lot of Iranians who live in the United States. There are a lot of Iranians who report back. I spoke at a small synagogue in Rockville, Maryland on a Sunday, and then 2 months later I saw somebody from the Iranian UN mission. He said, "Oh, I thought your presentation in August was really interesting," because somebody had reported on it. So this idea that we're going to be able to bluff the Iranians, I think, is a mistake. The idea that we're going to occupy Iran is not something I see a lot of American support for. We have to have, and I agree very much with many of the things that my friends Michael and Michael have said. This doesn't obviate our need for a genuine strategy. It doesn't remove our need for a regional strategy. We are going to have to deal with, whatever we do here, we're going to have a 5-year plan and a 10-year plan where Iran will play an important role. But I also agree with Mike Eisenstadt that the time to fix this is probably past, and the question we have to deal with is going forward with an Iran, which I think we're going to continue to have trouble with, what's the best position to do that from, with the world or against the world?
I think that's a really compelling point, and I think if the collapse of a deal makes war not certain but perhaps more likely, I would want to be with the world community if we are to reimpose even harsher sanctions, or if we have to go to war. I think it's preferable if we have to make that choice that we go in with allies and with a higher standing in the global community. And the alternative is one that we've lived through before and I think is unthinkable going forward. So appreciate your comments.
May I clarify a point?
Just briefly.
Yes, sir. Just want to make a point. Nobody wants invasion, and we're not talking about that. But in 2003, the U.S. presence on the ground in Iraq and Afghanistan did apparently cause Iran to suspend their weapons work. And it did help bring them to the negotiations with the Europeans at the time, I would argue. But since then, our credibility, I think, has slipped. And I would argue we don't want to threaten them in their face. There should not be an ultimatum. It should be subtle because that works better in this part of the world. And indirect threats and telegraph threats are much more effective, I think. So nobody's talking about getting in their face and threatening invasion and the like. So.
Dr. Fleming.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, I, for one, do not believe that a bad deal is ever better than no deal. And I'm very disappointed about what we have. I see this as a terrible agreement, and we should not support it. And it's a high watermark. It can only go down from here. I would say that it's equivalent to the 1938 Munich Agreement. I think it will lead to not peace, but to more war. We're already hearing that neighbors in the region of the Middle East are planning to build their own nuclear facilities, develop nuclear weapons in a very bad neighborhood. And certainly our closest friends and allies, Israel, I think are virtually unanimous in their belief that this is a bad deal, and I think we should listen to what they have to say. But there are some interesting points here. This deal provides Iran with a signing bonus of $50 to $150 billion of assets in overseas accounts and provides the economic growth associated with sanctions relief. And I'm particularly concerned about how the regime might use these funds to build up conventional capabilities of its own military, as well as those of its allies and terrorist proxies in the region, such as Hezbollah. General Dunford, the president's nominee to be the next chairman of the Joint Chiefs, really recently testified, and I quote, "I think it's reasonable to assume that if sanctions are lifted, the Iranians would have more money available for malign activities," end quote. So my question to Mr. Singh, Mr. Eisenstadt, could you describe how Iran might prioritize this money to support such malign military activities in the region?
Well, Congressman, as I mentioned before, my anticipation is that Iran will use whatever financial windfall it gets for a variety of purposes. And they've shown in the past that even under sanctions, even when they were under duress, they increased the amount they were willing to spend on security accounts for the IRGC, the Revolutionary Guards, the Ministry of Intelligence and Security, and overall military spending. So I don't see why that would change under these new circumstances, except they'll have a lot more money to spend, frankly. We care about this stuff because the things that Iran does, supporting proxies like Hezbollah, Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, undermining the sovereignty of governments in the region, directly threaten our interests and objectives in the region. Iran also, I think General Dempsey recently pointed out, is engaged in cyber activities, which we perceive as a threat. They have invested in sea-based mines and other means of sort of compromising freedom of navigation in regional waterways that are a threat. I don't think we should assume that this strategy will change. In fact, I think there's every reason to believe this strategy will continue. And all we can say for certain is that they will have more resources at their disposal and fewer sanctions impediments for pursuing that strategy. And I should just point out as a corollary that to me, the nuclear weapons program was not a standalone thing, not a lark. I think it was part of this strategy. And so that determination also remains there. And my big concern about the agreement is not that we shouldn't have a negotiated agreement. I think we should. I just don't believe that this one is sufficient to reliably prevent them from continuing to pursue that.
Mr. Eisenstadt?
The only thing I would add is that they'll probably prioritize proxies over their conventional military capabilities, except for the SAMs, which I think are important for them to provide an umbrella over their nuclear program going forward. And then among the proxies, it's Syria, Syrian Hezbollah, then Iraq, then probably the Houthis.
And doesn't this agreement also allow, over the course of the first 8 years or so, or maybe the first 10 years, for Iran to import more ballistic technology, which could not only enhance the threat regionally, but also even to the U.S.?
Yeah, this is something which I've not been able to get my arms around looking at this agreement. I mean, there is in the annex where they discuss the ballistic missiles, there is a paragraph which discusses a continued ban on the importation of technologies that could be used for the production of delivery systems for nuclear weapons. So that remains in place. You still have other sanctions related to missiles and the missile technology control regime. But we know, because they've published pictures of their missile production facilities, that they are still able to get stuff which is they should not have been able to get under the MTCR, and very large pieces of equipment and special materials and the like. So it's a leaky system. As before this agreement, I don't think the agreement will change anything in that regard. And in fact, after 8 years with the missiles, in some ways it might become a little bit easier for them, and they'll have more money, which you need to facilitate smuggling and violation of export controls and the like. Money helps a lot in that area. So.
All right. Thank you. I yield back.
Ms. Duckworth.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to continue this line of questioning. I think we can all agree that Iran is unlikely to change its regional behavior in the wake of this agreement. And I think that we've sort of talked about that they will have more funds. In addition to spending the funds in other places, they'll have more funds to expend for their proxies in the region. But I want to know what post-deal confrontation looks like. What should the U.S. response be? Are we more involved? Do we get more engaged in Syria? Are we going to end up having to spend more time holding the Gulf state back from their attempts to now develop nuclear weapons themselves? What is the U.S. involvement in the region? Are we going to be more involved in places like Lebanon, Yemen? And will we need to do that in order to reassure our Gulf state allies? Mr. Singh?
I do think that as a result of the agreement, but also as a result of just the chaotic regional situation and Iran's involvement in these conflicts, we will need to be more involved, not less involved in the Middle East going forward. And I think that will take any number of forms. John talked about some of them. I mentioned some of them. It will take the form of assistance and exercises and things like that with allies. It will take the form of intelligence focus on Iran and on its proxies and so forth to keep a close eye. It will mean a robust forward presence in the region, which we have now, maintaining that or even enhancing it so that we can respond quickly if, for example, there's an Iranian breakout attempt or some conflict flares up far worse than we see now. But I do think it will also mean trying to do more to counter Iranian regional ambitions. And exactly what that looks like, it could be any number of things. It could be more involvement in the situation in Syria, getting finally a little bit more serious about trying to bring that conflict to an end, putting more pressure on the Assad regime. It could look like responding more forcefully to Iranian provocations through the Strait of Hormuz. Remember, one thing that we saw just a few months ago was a more aggressive posture by Iranian fast ships in the Strait of Hormuz, taking some cargo ships captive. We didn't really respond to that. And so I think one thing we'll need to think about is responding more forcefully in such situations.
So if the deal fails, what is U.S. involvement looks like? Is it, and specifically I want to know what the Gulf states, how will they react? And then, are we then dealing with the Gulf states attempting to amp up their nuclear ambitions and feeling the need that with no restraints on Iran, they need to develop nuclear weapon capability themselves? What is that alternative?
So I don't think that if this deal doesn't go forward for any number of reasons, I don't think it's right to say there are no restraints on Iran in the sense that, remember, Iran still was careful in the past because of the U.S. military threat not to rush forward, not to cross certain lines. Iran still has to worry about American deterrence. We shouldn't sort of factor that out of the equation. It's not as though the deal, if the deal doesn't limit them at all, in fact, in these areas. It's our deterrence, our posture in the region that deters them. I think all the deal does is, number one, in this front, send conflicting signals to allies and cause them to worry more about what is our strategy in the region. And number two, it lifts some key sanctions on Iran and provides Iran with more financial assets to pursue that strategy. So I don't think the regional situation looks dramatically different, except for the U.S. standing and the Iranian capability in that circumstance.
I don't know who wants to answer this one. What is the Gulf states' reaction to no deal?
I don't think they can contemplate it, to be honest. They are used to having governments that make executive agreements. The idea of powerful legislators who tell the princes, you're not going to do this, is not something they think a lot about. What they are thinking mostly about is, what does this mean for American intentions, American commitment, American assurances? They will try to read that. I think they will see a less constrained Iran as more menacing, and they will want to feel us even more, and they will want to feel other countries even more because they'll want an array of support. I think they also will get increasingly concerned that the White House doesn't speak for the U.S. government, and they will want to de-emphasize the United States to the extent they can in their strategies because of a lack of confidence that when U.S. government officials tell them something, it will represent U.S. government policy.
And would that carry out over to any, whether it's whichever party controls the White House?
I think it would. One of the concerns in the Gulf states that I've sort of picked up reading between the lines is their concern sometimes that Americans don't always understand they're evil people in the world and we should really have enemies. And I think the Gulf states, on the one hand, understand they really have enemies, but they also talk to their enemies. For all the UAE is staunchly opposed to the Iranian nuclear program, there's billions of dollars in trade between the UAE and Iran. And I think that they want us to figure out what we were really trying to do.
Okay, thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Kaufman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you all for being here today and for sharing your expertise with us. Can you reflect on why the President of the United States took this agreement before the United Nations for a vote prior to taking it, prior to allowing Congress to vote on the agreement? Anybody like to comment on that?
Well, I suspect you know the answer. I suspect he wanted to be unencumbered and, if possible, to present Congress with a fait accompli. I mean, I think that's kind of the the logic of executive prerogative. So.
It seems to me that the president has a view about foreign policy and national security based on sort of a peace through diplomacy approach. But I had met in 2009 went to Israel and met separately with Prime Minister Netanyahu, President Perez, and the Chief of Staff of the IDF, and I asked them the same question. And I said, well, how would you best propose to stop Iran? What is your recommendation from stopping Iran to attain a nuclear weapon? And they all actually had the same answer in separate meetings, and they said that you should impose economic sanctions that are harsh enough to where the government of Iran worries about a collapsing economy and losing power, political power, as a result of that. I wonder if you'd all would comment on that.
Well, I think that that's right, and that was the U.S. approach for a long time. It was to combine diplomacy with these coercive elements to try to produce a sort of cost-benefit analysis by Iran that it had no choice but to sort of give up its nuclear weapons ambitions and maybe to embark on a broader strategic shift. I think that when we get ourselves into trouble, it's when we sort of just choose one tactic over the others and sort of reject all the other tools in our toolkit. And I think what happened here was that we lost the coercive element to it. You know, in negotiations, you've got the deal, and then you've got what are the consequences for not accepting the deal. It's sort of what we talk about here. What are the alternatives? But I think when we posed the alternatives to Iran, they simply weren't very threatening because the language that we were using was essentially that we needed a deal, that we didn't have good alternatives to the deal, and this gets to the question of the credibility of the military threat. And so I think that what was coercive diplomacy lost the coercive element. And if we had kept that in play, if we had used that more smartly, I think we could have gotten a stronger agreement.
Congressman, I think the Iranians, certainly Hassan Rouhani, thinks that if this doesn't go through, he will be out of power. I think his strategic view has been for about 15 years that the level of animus between Iran and the world harms Iranian national security. He argued when he was the Secretary General of the Supreme Council on National Security back in about 2000, 2001, that we should knock down the walls of mistrust between Iran and the West with bulldozers. That's not because he doesn't think that the West has malign intent toward Iran, and a lot of Iranians can give you a whole litany of Western offenses against Iran, but because he thinks that level of antagonism, a level of violence between our societies undermines Iranian national security. And I think that he has made the decision, not that the West is really a warm and friendly place that's going to respect Iranian interests, but that level of hatred and animus is harmful, and this deal provides a way to lower the temperature. I would argue that would also serve American security interests and stability.
And let us not pretend that this is a democracy. There's a vetting process for anybody to run that is through the supreme leader, and so I think that one of the problems with American foreign policy is we want to believe that everybody is really at the end of the day just like us, and if given the opportunity, they will be like us.
Sir, I would suggest
but let me finish here. I think that's it's a fundamental flaw in this agreement. Because I think that's the basis of the president's view when he came into the White House. It was that he didn't believe in sanctions. He didn't believe in economic sanctions. He believed that if we treat Iran just like any other country, they will behave like any other country, and that is a very high-risk strategy with a very low probability of success. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Dr. Winstrup?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, I do appreciate you being here and having frank discussion with us today. Mr. Alderman, you mentioned that this deal is adequate, and frankly, I think it's far less than adequate. And when the notion of no deal, to me, is actually more adequate than the deal that is on the table. What we are doing today does more to keep us safe than what this deal does. And you mentioned Iranians writhing in pain, and I would like to point out, as a surgeon in Iraq, what writhing in pain looks like. And when you see an American soldier that has been hit by an IED provided by Iran, that is writhing in pain. And if they're writhing in pain, it's because of the actions of their government and their people. And I can't find anything since 1979 that would give us any indication that we should trust in this government and these people. You mentioned Rouhani. He is not the leader. Khomeini is, and he has publicly stated before and after this agreement that they will continue to be an adversary of the United States and attack the United States. This agreement allows them to be more capable of that. It enhances their opportunity for weapons to kill Americans. And the other thing that's been said is, it's this deal or war. I would like to ask you a question. What is war? Is war going to battle? Is that what war means to you? I'm just trying to get your opinion of what that statement might mean.
First, I don't agree with the idea that it's this agreement.
I'm asking a different question.
No, but I don't agree that I don't agree with the formulation. It's this deal or war. I think it's this deal with the world behind us, or it's this deal with us sailing against the world. And I think that makes
okay. Let me point something out. You mentioned how cooperative Russia and China have been. They're not being threatened by this government. We are. Russia and China is not hearing death to Russia, death to China. It's a lot easier for them to be cooperative and to give in on this stuff. But I ask you the question, to you, this deal or war, what does war mean to you?
No, so you talked about the writhing in pain, and I know veterans, I'm sure you do, and I live right behind Naval Medical Center, and I have seen unspeakable injuries, so I don't diminish that at all. I've also met Iranian veterans of the war with Iraq who they believe have been crippled for life by chemical weapons that the U.S. turned a blind eye to.
My question now, thank you very much for your comments on my comment. My question right now is, what do you conceive to be war? We have heard this statement, it's this deal or war. What do you perceive that as? Going to battle? What does that mean to you?
War can be any number of covert actions, overt actions, limited war, unlimited war, efforts to depose the government, efforts to punish the government. We could see any number of things with any number of people on our side and any number of people on their side. I think what we are sometimes missing about Iran, not that Iran is a democracy, but Iran has genuine politics. I think Iran has genuine politics. It's hard to be serious about the history of Iran since 1979, from Ayatollah Khomeini, who had dominant control because of his spiritual position, to Ayatollah Khamenei, who has much less of the gravitas that his leader did. He sort of got a cheap promotion up to being Ayatollah to make things work. It's a country of politics. And I think what the administration has tried to do is to see if there's something to unlock in the politics that will make Iran less of a threat. But I think the whole spectrum of war is available to us. The whole spectrum of war is available to the Iranians. I think we will win. I don't think the Iranians can beat us. But what does that look like? And
Well, the point I'm trying to make is we have given up so much that down the road liberates the Iranians to do what they say they want to do, which is to kill Americans, okay? And so when it comes to war, there are other components. And I think that when we hear that statement coming from a high level in our government, people in America perceive that as going to battle. These gentlemen talked about it. I believe they understand all the components of war, which is diplomacy, military sometimes is a deterrent, often as a deterrent, like the Cold War, sanctions, which we are giving up, and sharing of intelligence and building a relationship with our allies that also look at this enemy as an adversary. And I'd like maybe you to comment on some of the other components of war that we could be using and are not, if you would.
Well, look, I think the question of deterrence is a very important question. And I think that the idea that we had no choice but to make this deal does discount the role that deterrence plays in shaping the decisions of other countries, of adversaries. And I think that going forward, maintaining that deterrence is going to be awfully important to any successful U.S. policy in the region.
Thank you, and unfortunately my time has expired. I yield back.
Ms. Walorski.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, gentlemen, for being here. And I guess, Mr. Alterman, I think and we've sat here for 2 hours, and I appreciate you indulging us. But I think, to your point that you've just been talking about for the last couple of minutes here, about Iran being a country of politics and alluding to the fact that one of the issues is, from the world point of view and from an Iranian point of view, they're used to dealing with other nations that have princes, that don't have a legislative body. And I think that's one of the reasons why there's such a disconnect in this country, because we are talking about, we're not talking about little treaties and little things about tanks and small arms. The American people in the United States of America do understand this is an existential threat we're talking about. It's an existential threat now. We're talking about nuclear weapons. We're talking about an existential threat to Israel, and we're talking about an existential threat to our homeland. That's what we're talking about, or we would not be involved in this quote-unquote agreement. And, that's where I think a lot of the issue comes down to. We do have a separation of powers. Before we enter something like this, which existentially is a threat to all of us, the American people do have a right to know through their representatives sitting here today and having a look at that document and being allowed to vote. My question is on the perception of what's going to happen after this vote and whether we have enough votes to override a presidential veto. I happen to think it's going to be very close. Or what the president's been up to, he wouldn't have been up to, and he's really calling everybody in. He needs every single vote. What are we going to look like to the rest of the world as a split nation? There's no mandate. There's no giant majority. There's a couple of votes over the top that gets this bill through, which is, I think, where we're going to be. What perception, then, does the world take on that? A president that doesn't even have a majority of agreement in his own nation?
What I've read in foreign newspapers in the last week is something of surprise that there's a debate going on in the United States that's not going on in other places. We have people invoking the Holocaust. We have all sorts of things that in the rest of the world is just considered to be strange.
Because the rest of the world's not a superpower. The rest of the world doesn't dictate peace and freedom and fight for those things and fight for the freedom of people. The rest of the world are apples to us being an orange. So in the peer level that we had with Russia and China, and to my representative colleague's point, they're not victims or targets of this aggression. We're the victim and the target of the aggression. We're the ones that have watched Iran operate in Iraq, killing Americans, involving themselves in Yemen, involving themselves as the largest state sponsor of terrorism with Hezbollah and Hamas. We're the ones that have watched that. We're the ones that sent American blood and money to free these countries from the oppression of these terrorist regimes. Largest state sponsor of terror, no changing the mind of the Ayatollah, and here we sit. And that's why the American people are so divided, and I think we're going to see a divided answer to this question on the agreement. It may lose by a couple, it may win by a couple, but at the end of the day, the perception then doesn't change.
So the perception that we're
The
fighting
perception of the
Iran
world, the perception of Iran doesn't change.
Congresswoman.
There's no major majority. Yeah.
If I could just weigh in here, 'cause
Yeah.
I think there's an important point here, I think, which is it's an open secret that I think a lot of folks on both sides of the aisle are concerned about whether this agreement is sufficient. And so what I anticipate will happen going forward as we look ahead is that whoever comes into office next as president, regardless of party, may find that this is insufficient, may find themselves wanting to strengthen the nuclear constraints on Iran. And that's going to be very tough to do. It's going to be very tough to get allied support for that, frankly, because when we talk about are the P5+1 with us, I was working on this in the mid-2000s, and I remember how hard it was to get even European support when they had the business deals they had with Iran. And I think getting support to strengthen the nuclear constraints in the future, which I think any president is inevitably going to want to do, is going to be quite hard. And then if you look at the agreement itself, it's clear that there are ambiguities over other relevant issues, like does the agreement give us the authority, give us the ability to impose sanctions on Iran for terrorism and human rights that sort of mirror the effects of the sanctions we're now relieving? We think that it does, and I think Secretary Kerry has testified to that point. It's not clear to me, though, that our allies agree with that. And so that sets up a very difficult situation for us because, who knows if we'll have that support.
Can I ask you one quick question before I run out of time? Other than Iran, I think in this agreement, personally, I think the United States is a loser. I think Israel's a loser. Who are the other winners in this agreement besides Iran? Who gains the most?
Well, I think those who gain the most are anyone who wants to do business with Iran, anyone who sees Iran as a strategic partner, frankly.
I yield back. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Stefanik.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I want to follow up on Dr. Fleming's questions. This deal does not shut down or even limit the production of Iran's ballistic missile program. Iran will continue to maintain a ballistic missile capability that is the largest inventory in the Middle East, as well as developed an ICBM capable of reaching the U.S. So as you know, this type of capability is a very real threat to our national security, and we need all possible tools available to deter and protect ourselves and our allies from the devastation potentially from Iranian ballistic weapons. So given that this deal rolls back the missile embargo on Iran, how will increased ballistic missile cooperation by Russia and China impact Iran's ICBM program? And I'll start with you, Mr. Singh.
Well, Congresswoman, I think this is a big gap in the agreement. And if you remember with the agreed framework, what happened after the agreed framework was suddenly the conversation turned to missiles and the North Korean missile launches, which happened in the second part of the 1990s. And my concern is that that's what will happen here because, as you said, the ban on launches especially goes away with this agreement. It turns from a binding ban to non-binding hortatory language in the new resolution. I think we need to be concerned with Iran's medium-range ballistic missiles, which could put our bases and our forces within range, which are inherently, according to what I've seen reported, nuclear capable. And I think we need to worry about those ICBMs. And if you look at past testimony, open testimony by U.S. intelligence officials, the sort of timelines for ICBMs always specify with critical foreign assistance. That critical foreign assistance becomes a lot easier as sanctions are lifted in 8 years, or if sanctions are lifted before 8 years under certain stipulations here. And so again, my worry is that this is inherently part of a nuclear weapons program. You need a delivery vehicle. My worry is that the deal will actually allow them to perfect this relatively underdeveloped component of their nuclear weapons program.
And one more follow-up, Mr. Singh, before we go to the other witnesses. Can you give me your full personal assessment on the threat to U.S. soil today from the Iranian ICBM at its current stage in development?
I don't know that I have the details to do that. I don't think that we've seen anything to indicate the Iranians have reached that capability yet. They've engaged in space launch activities and so forth. That's out in the open. But I couldn't tell you sort of a timeline as to when will they get there and so forth. I think it depends on a lot of variables. But in a classified setting, I'm sure that's a question that should be posed to U.S. officials.
Thank you, Mr. Eisenstadt.
I'll just add a few points. First of all, as I mentioned before, they already seem to be able to get, despite the restrictions that have been on them in the form of UN resolutions and missile technology control regime constraints, they've still been able to get technology and move forward slowly but surely with their program. So the their access to frozen funds will, I think, enable them to ramp up the smuggling activities. Again, money facilitates kind of, shell companies and the activities of middlemen who are engaged in this kind of smuggling. So I assume they'll be able to ramp that up. Secondly, I will mention that there is no mention of cruise missiles in the deal, and they recently unveiled in the last year a cruise missile they call the Sumar, which is based on the old Soviet KH-55. Air-launched cruise missile. They modified it to make it a land attack cruise missile. If it has the range of the original Soviet system, that's 2,500 to 3,000 kilometers. That's a long-range cruise missile. We don't know how successful they were with the reverse engineering, but I'm very concerned that this was in the Soviet inventory their primary their Air Force's primary nuclear delivery system. And now the Iranians are producing their own version of it, and there's absolutely, the agreement says nothing about that. So that's something I'm very concerned about. In terms of their ability to reach the U.S., they're not here yet. I mean, they've been working on, they have missiles that have 2,000-kilometer range, which means they could range southeastern Europe from their part of the world. If they were to put them on a ship, and people have speculated about this possibility, put it on a civilian transport ship and put it off the coast of the U.S., they could reach us conceivably, or if they were to get a land base in this hemisphere. And then finally, this will just simply complicate our missile defense challenge. We've been selling a lot of missile defenses to our allies in this part of the world, and as they move forward with their capabilities in this area, we're going to have to do more. But there's a lot more we need to do with our allies in terms of interoperability and sharing of information that they're not doing right now to ensure that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts.
Thank you. Dr. Alterman?
In the last 7 minutes, 7 seconds, I'll tell you I grew up in Poughkeepsie, and your district is one of my favorite places in the whole world.
I'm happy to hear that. Thank you. I yield back.
Ms. McSally.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, gentlemen, for your testimony today. Mr. Singh, you mentioned it seemed like, this is fait accompli, like, Congress can't change this, and there's been a lot of discussion on that really in the media. But, the reality is this isn't a treaty like the CFE treaty. Maybe perhaps it should have been, but it's not. And if you look back in history, there's been, according to Mark Dubowitz, who talked to us yesterday, over 200 occasions where there's been a treaty or an agreement that came to Congress, and Congress provided amendments to that treaty or international agreement and said, look, we're going to vote on this thing, but you needed to go back to the table and you need to make this a better deal. And over 200 times this has happened. So all of a sudden there's this dynamic going on, like we've forgotten that this is the way the three branches of the government work, and we got to either take this deal, it's up or down, it's Chicken Little, it's we go with this deal only because this administration has negotiated this deal, this bad deal, are we even in this situation? And somehow Congress really can't do anything about it. So why can't we go back and say, we will potentially agree to this deal if it has the following, 5, 6, or 7 amendments. Go back to the table. That's what leaders do. That's what leaders of the free world do. Bring our allies back together and say, Congress will approve this under the following restraints. Why can't we do that? Why is this narrative continuing to, perpetuate that Congress is, we're just spectators in this whole thing as opposed to demanding we have a better deal like we've done in the past?
Well, Congresswoman, look, I think in terms of the premise, I agree with you. If you look at the history of arms control agreements, there have been agreements that Congress didn't accept. For example, I mentioned before, the SALT II agreement was withdrawn from consideration. We had other arms control agreements with the Soviets that never went forward because of opposition or because the situation on the ground changed. And we didn't think that it was any longer the appropriate agreement for what we were trying to accomplish. And certainly if this were considered a treaty and the administration couldn't muster the 2/3 support that it needed, then the logical option would be to go back and try to renegotiate the points that need to be renegotiated. You could argue that that also means that those who oppose it need to be specific in their opposition, say here's what isn't strong enough and here's what we need to see improved. And I do think that's important here. And if you look at what we've written, and I know this is true of many of you as well, there are specific points which are not deemed sufficient. I think the trouble here is the mechanism is obviously quite different, and you've acknowledged that. This has already been blessed by the UN Security Council. The adoption date is 90 days from when it was voted on, which is just 30 days then past when Congress will get to review it. And the question is, what will happen? If Congress disapproves, could the parties go ahead and implement anyway? And then that sort of puts us in this position of opposing the agreement that we ourselves negotiated. Or would the other party simply walk away and say this doesn't work without U.S. participation? In which case, as I've argued, because our allies still will oppose Iran developing a nuclear weapon, I think that they may not like the situation, but I think we're still then back to the drawing board and trying to renegotiate a stronger deal. Look, under any other circumstance, if a deal doesn't have the sufficient domestic support, you go back and renegotiate it.
Exactly. Thank you. I only have a little bit of time left, but another consideration, I was in the military. I deployed 6 times to the region. I put my life on the line with many of my colleagues in order to defend our interests in this region. We have many dead American soldiers because of Iran and what they did in Iraq, what they've done in Lebanon as a state sponsor of terror. This is very personal for those of us who served in uniform. We are deeply concerned that with the influx of cash that they're going to have, they're going to continue to grow their conventional capability, increase their air defenses, increase their ability to shoot down our pilots, close the Straits of Hormuz, do all the things. I mean, I've been briefed. I'm well aware of the military option as it exists right now. It becomes much more dangerous in the future, 10 years from now, for those of us who are like, well, at least we buy time. But we buy time with a state sponsor of terror, with an influx of cash to build their conventional and non-conventional capability that's going to kill more Americans if we actually have to do a military option later, and the increase of risk to American lives. Could you just comment on that?
Well, I do think that that's right. And my worry is that when you do a deal like this with a party which hasn't had any kind of strategic shift, if we know that Iran is still determined to carry out that strategy, then my worry is that we will be finding ourselves encountering those things in the future, and that the military option does get more difficult as you go forward, as Iran arms itself, as you have international folks inside those nuclear facilities,
Right.
and as they've been granted sort of international legitimization.
Thank you, and Mr. Eisenstadt. And I would say difficult is a clinical word. More Americans are going to die. That's what it comes down to.
I'll just add, with I see we're out of time, that given, I see the possibility that 10 years down the road, 15 years down the road now, next time they'll be, if they build another clandestine facility like they did at Fordo and Natanz, those are relatively shallow. Next time it'll be much deeper. They have world-class expertise in super hardened concrete and in tunneling. And I'm not sure we have a military option with our current conventional capabilities 10 or 15 years down the road.
Great, thank you. My time's expired. I yield back.
Y'all have been very patient through a variety of questions. I'm going to impose on you just a moment longer because, and you've kind of talked around these things, but I just want to get each of your brief thoughts. One of the things that concerns lots of people around the world is the growing conflict between Sunni and Shia. We see it in Iraq, we see it in Yemen, and the concern that that spreads to even more violent, even more widespread sort of conflict. Does this agreement have any effect on the likelihood of a Sunni versus Shia open war?
Well, Congressman, you've heard some folks say that in the wake of this agreement, maybe Iran would be a partner against ISIS. I think that's misguided because I think the more Iran is active in the region, the more it's engaged in these conflicts in places like Syria, in Iraq and so forth. And in Syria, there's a very strong indication that Iran is really at the forefront of the battle that the regime is waging. I think that exacerbates sectarian conflict. I think that feeds movements like ISIS rather than sort of diminishing them. And so I think looking at Iran as a partner, when in fact Iran has been filling the same vacuum that some of these other groups are trying to fill, is mistaken. And I worry that will get worse, not better, in the wake of the deal.
I'll just add, I mean, I agree with that, and the idea that we partner with Iran as part of this campaign just will feed the impression that our idea of the best way to counter Sunni jihadists is by partnering with Shia jihadists. And again, that simply is a lethal combination that exacerbates the conflict in the region. But even if we don't overtly partner with Iran, there's the perception that we're tacitly partnered with them. And even if we successfully parry those perceptions, the fact is that the additional money that is available under this agreement will enable Iran to ramp up support for its allies and partners in the region that are key actors in the sectarian conflicts. So I think we should expect further intensification. And also just the perception that Iran is coming out of this as, if this, from their point of view, feeds into their narrative of a rising Iran that is triumphant in the region, and that will simply only further exacerbate the fears of the Sunnis in this part of the world and feed recruiting for ISIL and al-Qaeda affiliates.
Mr. Chairman, I think we have gotten a little fixated on how fixed sectarian identity is and how important it is. It's not very long ago that there was lots of intermarriage between Sunnis and Shia throughout the region. There were mass conversions to Shia Islam in Iraq in the late 19th century. We're not really sure why. These categories have gotten more fixed, and it's partly because people have seen this as a proxy for a state battle, and they've used religious terms, religious categories, in order to fight between Saudi Arabia and its allies on one hand and Iran on the other. I think the goal of this agreement, in part, is that it creates incentives for Iran to try to be like a more normal country, a country which wants to have investors come in. It needs tens of billions, hundreds of billions of dollars invested in its oil industry, its gas industry. They want trade. I mean, there are a lot of signs that there are parties in Iran who want Iran to be a much more normal place. Try going somewhere in an Iranian passport as a tourist. There aren't a lot of places to go, and you don't have money to spend. And so I think there is the possibility of incentives that Iran will cease to be the kind of country Congressman McSally described, in many cases very accurately, that the long history of antagonism between us and Iran will diminish. They talk about how we helped overthrow Mossadegh in '53, and we were involved supporting Saddam Hussein in the '80s and so on, and they can be more normal. And a more normal Iran is not going to be an Iran that is feeding the flames of this sectarian violence, or more normally, Iran is going to act like a more normal state. I'm not sure that'll happen. I hope it happens. And if it happens or if it doesn't, I think we want the world with us.
Yeah.
If I could, Chairman, if I could just comment on that, because I think that if you look at the deal, I don't think it does provide that incentive. The sanctions are rolled back maybe to where they were in, say, 2006 or 2007. I was working on Iran policy at the time, and I can tell you before these sanctions were imposed, Iran was not being helpful. Before the sanctions were imposed in the mid-1990s on preventing U.S. oil companies from going in, Iran was not acting as a sort of more helpful, more normal state. And so I think, yes, we would all like to see Iran shift its strategy. We'd all like to see Iran change its behavior in the region, but I think that actually we're not confronting Iran with that strategic choice. My worry is that we've allowed them to escape that strategic choice by sort of having their cake and eating it too, keeping their current strategy, their current nuclear weapons capability, and getting the sanctions relief on top of that.
Okay. Well, I guess some people describe this as the big bet, whether more contact with Iran, the investment and so forth, will lead to a different sort of regime or not. One more right quick, and y'all have talked about this kind of, but nuclear proliferation, does this make it more or less likely? You know, you can argue it from both sides, which is why I asked the question. Dr. Alterman, I'll start with you this time.
I think creating a structure of rigorous inspections creates an anticipation that the world will take any nudge toward nuclear weapons capability from any state very seriously. Deciding that this is just too hard, that we're not going to ask intrusive questions, I think will send a signal for people that the Iranians are likely to go their way, and if the Iranians go their way, if they're going to have a bomb, I want a bomb.
So on balance, you think that signal to the world outweighs the pressure that'll be on the Gulf states and other Sunni Arabs to have some sort of capability?
In the event, so if we go forward with this agreement, will the Gulf states feel they need to develop a weapon? No, I think if we go forward with the agreement, the Gulf states will be whispering in our ear every day, saying, make sure you're serious, make sure you enforce it.
Yeah, okay.
If I could just, actually, in a way, the kind of the cat's out of the bag, was we've already started seeing since around 2005 or so a series of contracts that have been concluded by, I think the Turks have contracts with Russian companies, the Egyptians have some contracts, and the Gulf GCC decided, and I think in 2005 as well, to kind of enhance their civilian nuclear infrastructure. So we're already seeing hedging behavior. And this is a long-term process. It'll last decades. So I think this will perhaps reinforce this trend, but the trend really is already underway. But again, it's in the form of creating civilian infrastructures which are inherently dual use, and then down the road, you know, countries have options. But this is going to be a very long-term thing, and I think the administration made a mistake in thinking that if you prevent Iran from getting the bomb, then you could prevent a proliferation cascade. But the problem is, you know, people hedge before that. They don't wait till you already got the bomb. And if you have a robust infrastructure, that is the trigger for kind of a proliferation cascade of similar infrastructures throughout the region, and that's already underway. So,
and you know, Mr. Chairman, right now the United States seems to love timetables. We set a timetable for withdrawal from Afghanistan. We set a timetable in Iraq. This agreement has a timetable as well. It has these sunset clauses. After 10 years, you know what restrictions are going to be lifted from Iran. After 15 years, you know what restrictions are going to be lifted. And so if you're another country in the region, those restrictions being lifted it's not based on Iranian performance. It's not based on the IAEA having a finding that Iran's program is exclusively peaceful. It's just based on the passage of time. And so you've got to circle that date on your calendar and say, by this date, I have to make certain assumptions about where Iran will be and what it might do. And you've got to then plan against that. And my worry is, look, there's no impediment, really, to them doing that. There's no impediment to them starting up their own programs, and they certainly have the means and the resources to do that. It's not easy, but they have a lot of resources at their disposal, as Secretary Kerry has noted.
Okay. All very helpful. Obviously, this is a big vote for all members, and I really appreciate y'all's insights in helping us work our way through many of these issues. So thank you again for being here. With that, the hearing stands adjourned.